The footage begins the way so much truth begins these days, grainy, unremarkable, almost easy to dismiss. A dashboard camera mounted at eye level behind the sun visor of a Calhoun Falls Police Department cruiser records the world in the washed-out palette of cheap government optics. The timestamp in the lower right corner reads 6:47 p.m. The date is a Thursday in August. The heat index outside is 103 degrees, and the asphalt of Route 9 shimmers the way asphalt does in Georgia. Summers, like the road itself, is trying to get somewhere cooler. For the first 40 seconds, there is nothing on that footage worth watching. Pine trees, a mailbox, the faded yellow of the double center line, the ordinary, unambitious geography of a county that most Americans drive through without stopping and never think about again. And then, the car appears. It materializes out of the heat shimmer like something conjured rather than driven. A 1969 Dodge Charger RT in slate black, so deep it seems to absorb the Georgia light rather than reflect it. The chrome accents catch the late sun and throw it back in sharp, narrow flashes. The engine note a low, authoritative rumble that you feel in your sternum before your ears register it, reaches the cruiser's microphone a half-second before the car fully resolves into frame. 4 years of work sit in that car. 4 years of Saturdays and late nights and phone calls to parts dealers in Nevada and Michigan, and 2 separate restoration specialists in Tennessee who had never seen a body in this particular condition and weren't sure they wanted to start. 4 years of a man choosing patience over shortcuts, doing each thing right before moving to the next one, rebuilding something from the ground up because he believed that things worth having were worth earning properly. The man driving it is Colonel Marcus Webb. You don't know that yet watching the footage. What you see is a black man, 47 years old, wide through the shoulders, wearing a plain heather gray t-shirt and worn jeans. Aviator sunglasses, one hand resting on the steering wheel at 10 o'clock, the other in his lap. He is driving at exactly 38 miles per hour in a 45 zone. His turn signals work. His brake lights work. His registration is current. He is committing no violation of any law, statute, code, or ordinance in the state of Georgia or any other state in the Union. He is simply driving south on Route 9 through Calhoun Falls County, heading for Fort Gordon, where he is scheduled to meet Major General Leonard Cross at 0800 the following morning to discuss a classified restructuring of Joint Special Operations Command training protocols. He is driving rather than flying because the Charger had just come off its final road test 2 weeks ago, and he wanted to put proper miles on it before winter. He is 5 miles under the speed limit because he learned a long time ago that a black man in a car worth more than most houses in rural Georgia attracts attention the way blood in the water attracts things that bite. He has already seen the cruiser. He spotted it 40 seconds ago, tucked into a gravel turnout behind a Dairy Queen billboard that read somewhat optimistically, "Sweet deals just like Mom's." The Ford Explorer Interceptor was sitting in the shadow of that billboard, the way a cat sits in the shadow of a bird feeder, utterly still, utterly focused, watching the road with a specific kind of hunger that has nothing to do with public safety. Webb checked his speedometer, checked his mirrors, placed his right hand back on the wheel at the 2 o'clock position, spread his fingers deliberately wide the way a man spreads his hands when he wants them to be visible from a distance. He has memorized this script. He memorized it long before he enlisted, sitting in the back seat of his mother's Buick on the drive home from church in Savannah while she told him in a low, careful voice what to do if a police car ever pulled in behind them. He has rehearsed it in his head every time he's driven through the South in civilian clothes, which is often because Fort Gordon is in Augusta, Georgia, and he has been stationed there 3 times in his career. The cruiser pulls out of the turnout. The gravel crunches loud enough for the dash cam microphone to pick it up. No lights yet, just the silent, deliberate stalk of a vehicle that has decided on its destination before it has announced its intention. It rides Webb's bumper for exactly 1 mile. Close enough that the camera picks up the driver's silhouette through the windshield. Shaved head, sunglasses, the rhythmic motion of someone chewing gum with aggressive, territorial energy. Then the lights come on. Blue and red strobes detonate across the Charger's immaculate hood, fracturing the late afternoon light into something violent and chaotic. They paint the pine trees on either side of Route 9 in alternating colors. They bounce off the asphalt and come back up fragmented and wrong. In the front seat of the Charger, Colonel Marcus Webb exhales once through his nose. It is the only external indication of anything happening inside him. His speedometer doesn't change. His hands don't move. He signals his right turn with the same unhurried precision he has applied to everything in his life since the age of 22. When a drill sergeant at Fort Benning told him that the difference between a soldier and a man playing dress-up was the ability to choose his response rather than surrender to his reaction. He pulls onto the gravel shoulder. He kills the engine. He rolls the window down. He places both large hands on the top of the steering wheel, palms up. Fingers spread wide so that anyone approaching from behind can see clearly that there is nothing in them. He stares straight ahead. The narrator in this story. If this story had a narrator speaking directly to you, would tell you something important right here in this moment, before the cruiser door opens, before the footsteps come, before the first word is spoken. Officer Dale Pruitt had just made the most expensive mistake of his career. He had not yet taken a single step. He had not yet opened his mouth. He had done nothing yet except pull over a man for no reason on a Georgia highway on a Thursday in August. But the mechanism was already in motion. The avalanche had already begun. And by the time the phone rang at the station, it was going to be far, far too late to stop it. Dale Pruitt was 34 years old, and he had never in his adult life been told no by anyone who mattered. This was not an accident. This was a carefully constructed reality built brick by brick over 7 years on the Calhoun Falls Police Department, and Pruitt was both its architect and its primary beneficiary. He was not a large man physically. 5'11", soft around the middle in the way that men go soft when their metabolism slows and their discipline doesn't compensate, with a face that ran permanently pink from some combination of rosacea and the particular kind of low-grade fury that comes from believing you deserve more than you have. He kept his hair clipped to the scalp every 2 weeks at Roy's barber shop on Franklin Street, where Roy had learned years ago not to ask about Pruitt's week. He had grown up in Calhoun Falls. His father had worked dispatch for the county sheriff's office for 22 years. His older brother Kyle had gone into used car sales and eventually into the auction business, first legitimately, then less so. Dale had joined the police department at 27 because it was the only institution in town that offered him what he actually wanted, which was not a paycheck or a pension or a sense of community service, but authority. The specific, unchecked, rubber-stamped authority of a badge in a small county where everyone knew everyone and the men in blue took care of each other. His nickname among certain colleagues, the ones who said it with a kind of rueful fondness rather than admiration, was the toll collector. It had started small, a warning issued or withheld, depending on whether the driver seemed like the type to complain. Then a pattern out-of-state plates, high-value vehicles drivers who looked like they might have money and might not have the connections to fight back. A fabricated probable cause he smelled. Marijuana he observed a swerve. The taillight had a manufacturer defect, and then the stop the search, the arrest, the impound. Civil asset forfeiture was the mechanism. Georgia state law allowed law enforcement to seize property suspected of involvement in a crime regardless of whether the owner was ever charged or convicted. It was a law designed to disrupt drug trafficking organizations. Pruitt had repurposed it as a personal revenue stream. The network that protected him was not complicated, but it was effective. Sergeant Ray Dobbs ran the booking desk and had been doing so for 20 years. Dobbs was not a bad man exactly. He was the kind of man who had made a series of small accommodations over a long career, each one individually defensible, and had arrived in his late 50s at a place he could no longer leave without burning down everything he'd built. He processed Pruitt's arrests without reading the probable cause statements too carefully. He filed the impound paperwork the same day so the vehicles moved through quickly. He did not ask questions because he had learned that the questions he didn't ask were the ones he didn't have to answer. Chief Gordon Falk sat at the top of the structure. Falk was 58 and had been chief for 11 years, appointed by a county commission that had not in living memory appointed anyone who made waves. He signed the auction approval forms that Dobbs placed on his desk without reading them. He attended the quarterly department review meetings and praised the seizure numbers as evidence of proactive policing. He took no direct cash. His insulation was his most carefully maintained asset, but his pension was funded by a department whose budget was padded by auction revenue, and he had chosen not to examine that arithmetic too closely. And then there was Kyle Pruitt, Dale's older brother by 4 years, the one who had the legitimate business as cover. Pruitt Auto Acquisitions, LLC was a shell of a company registered to a P.O. box in Augusta. Kyle ran the actual auctions through a management contract with a legitimate auction house in Macon, giving the whole operation enough legitimacy to survive a casual glance. The same 3 shell companies registered to Kyle's name to a college roommate named Drew Halton, who received $500 a month for the use of his name, and to an entity called Georgia Vehicle Recovery Partners, which did not exist in any meaningful sense, submitted bids on every auction. They coordinated. They kept bids low on the vehicles they'd already agreed to acquire. They split the proceeds on a schedule that Dale and Kyle had worked out on a bar napkin in 2019 and never formally documented. For 6 years, this machine had run without a single gear slipping. On the Thursday in August, when Dale Pruitt pulled out of the turnout behind the Dairy Queen billboard, he was experiencing what he would later in the wreckage of everything identify as the feeling of invincibility. He had done this 40-some times. 40-some times he had pulled over an out-of-state vehicle. 40-some times he had found sufficient pretense to arrest and impound, and 40-some times the machine had processed the outcome and moved on. The drivers complained sometimes. They got lawyers sometimes. The lawyers sent letters to Dobbs, who filed them in a drawer, and to Falk, who signed responses that his assistant drafted, and nothing ever came of it. He spotted the Charger when it was 200 yards from the billboard. The slate-black paint, the body lines of a car that hadn't been manufactured in over 50 years, the Virginia plates, the single black male driver visible through the windshield driving with both hands on the wheel like a man who expected to be watched. The hunger rose in Pruitt's chest the way it always did, clean and familiar and specific. He didn't clock the speed. He didn't need to fabricate a speed violation. He had a dozen other tools in his kit. He pulled out of the turnout, let the cruiser nose onto the asphalt, and fell in behind the Charger at a distance calculated to intimidate. Not close enough to constitute aggressive driving. Close enough to communicate intent. He rode the Charger's bumper for a mile, watching the driver's posture through the back window. The man didn't speed up, didn't slow down, didn't reach for anything. He drove with the mechanical, deliberate correctness of someone who had made peace with being watched, which Pruitt found irritating rather than reassuring. He preferred fear. Fear gave him something to work with. He hit the lights. The Charger pulled over the way a commercial aircraft lands smoothly, without drama, with the implicit assurance of a machine operated by someone who has done this before and will do it again and is not concerned about either event. Webb killed the engine and sat for 2 seconds in the sudden quiet of the Georgia roadside, listening to the tick of the cooling motor and the rattle of pine needles moving in the hot wind. Then he turned on the dome light, rolled the window down, placed both hands on top of the steering wheel, spread wide, and stared at the point where Route 9 vanished into the tree line ahead of him. He did not look in the mirror. He did not watch Pruitt approach. He had decided long ago that watching the officer come was a form of reactivity, and reactivity was the enemy of control. He listened instead. He heard the cruiser door. He heard the gravel under boots, heavy, deliberate, the walk of a man who wanted his approach to feel like a statement. He heard the tap of something hard against the Charger's rear tail light, a baton maybe, or the butt of a flashlight, which was a power move, a territorial marking the physical equivalent of a dog announcing its presence. He heard Pruitt's breathing before he heard Pruitt's voice. License and registration. Not a request. Not even really a demand in the conventional sense. More like an announcement the way a man who has never considered that he might be refused announces what he expects to receive. Webb did not rush. "Good afternoon, officer." His voice was perfectly neutral, the way a professional musician can play a piece without expression when expression would be inappropriate, not because the feeling isn't there, but because this is not the moment for it. "My wallet is in my back right pocket. My registration is in the glove box. I'm going to reach for my wallet first, if that's all right." Pruitt's hand dropped to his holster. The snap of the retention strap, deliberately unclipped, deliberately audible, pierced the ambient sound of the roadside. Insects. Wind. The distant sound of another car on Route 9, far enough away that it might as well have been on a different planet. "I didn't ask for a narration, boy." Pruitt leaned his forearm on the doorframe, bringing his face level with the window. He smelled of stale coffee and wintergreen gum and the specific, slightly sour smell of a man who sweats when he's performing. "Just get the ID, boy." The word landed in the interior of the Charger and occupied the space between them. It was a single syllable, 3 letters a word, that could mean many things in many contexts and meant one specific thing in this context on this road, in this county on a Thursday afternoon, and every adult in America who needed to understand that knew it without being told. Webb's jaw tightened. A fraction of movement barely perceptible, the kind of micro-expression that would only read on a face that was otherwise absolutely still. The kind of stillness that comes from having made a decision so complete and so deep that it had calcified into instinct, the decision that no man, regardless of the badge he wore or the gun he carried or the institutional machinery that stood behind him, was going to take from Marcus Webb, the thing that Webb's mother had told him was the one thing no one could take unless you handed it to them. His composure. He moved slowly. He reached into his back right pocket and produced his wallet. He removed the Virginia driver's license, Marcus J. Webb address in Charlottesville, and held it out the window between 2 fingers. He did not offer the military ID, not yet. He wanted to see how this played out first. Pruitt snatched the license with the casual contempt of a man taking back something that was already his. He looked at it without looking at it. His eyes were already moving to the Charger's interior cataloging. The custom dash, the restored gauges, the stitched leather seats, the care and expense that had gone into every surface of the car's cabin. Darius Webb. Pruitt said the name incorrectly, transposing the first and middle names, a tell of a man who doesn't actually read what's in front of him. "You from Virginia, Charlottesville?" "Yes." "Long way from home." Pruitt let the observation sit there like an accusation. "What are you doing in Calhoun Falls in a car like this?" "Driving through, officer." "Driving through." He repeated it with the mock thoughtfulness of a man who has had this conversation 40 times and knows exactly where it goes. "See, I had you doing 55 in a 45. I was doing 38, officer. I have the cruise control data logged in the onboard computer if you need it to confirm." Pruitt leaned in closer, bringing his face into the window frame until it was 6 inches from Webb's. The coffee and gum smell intensified. Webb did not move. He looked straight ahead. "Are you calling me a liar?" Webb turned his head. Slowly. He looked directly at Pruitt for the first time, and something happened in that moment that would be described later by the one witness who observed it from a distance. Rookie Officer Caleb Hines, who had pulled up behind the cruiser in a secondary unit and was watching from 40 yards back as the thing that seemed to make Pruitt momentarily forget what he was doing. Webb's eyes were dark brown, and they were completely, absolutely, terrifyingly calm. Not the calm of a man suppressing panic. Not the tight, manufactured calm of someone performing composure while something else screams underneath. The calm of a man who had been in rooms where decisions were made that determined whether other men lived or died, who had operated in environments where the cost of losing control of his own reaction was measured in human lives rather than paperwork, and who had trained that calm into himself so thoroughly over 25 years that it had become his resting state. It was the look, Hines would say later, of a man watching a lion from inside a car. The lion might be dangerous. The man knows it's dangerous, but the man is also inside a car, and the lion doesn't know what a car is. "I'm stating a fact," Webb said. "The cruise control data is objective." The falter lasted less than a second. Then, Pruitt's face hardened back into its default expression, a kind of contemptuous certainty, and he stepped back from the window. "Step out of the vehicle." "Am I under arrest, officer?" I said. "Step out of the car." Pruitt's voice went sharp. "A register higher, the register of a man who has felt his control of a situation wobble and is correcting for it with volume." His hand gripped the butt of the Glock on his hip, not drawing it, just touching it the way a man touches something familiar when he's unsettled. "Now." Webb ran the calculation in his head. Not whether to comply, he had already decided to comply, had decided it before he pulled over, had decided it the same way he always decided it, because compliance was the only path that ended in him driving away from this road under his own power and with his full rights intact. The calculation was about something else, about the specific coordinates of this moment and what they meant. He opened the door and stepped out. He rose to his full height of 6 feet 3 inches, and the physical reality of him, the breadth of his shoulders, the way he carried 220 pounds of muscle and discipline. Like it was nothing. The absolute stillness of his posture produced a visible effect on Pruitt, who took a half step back and then overcompensated by straightening to his full 5'11" and squaring his jaw. "Turn around, hands on the roof, spread your legs." Webb complied. He placed his large hands on the Charger's roof, the metal scorching his palms. It had been sitting in direct August sunlight, and spread his feet shoulder-width apart. He stared at the pine trees on the far side of Route 9. A hawk was working a thermal about 200 feet up, circling with the patient, efficient grace of something that understood leverage. Officer Webb said, his voice carrying with the ease of a man accustomed to making himself heard over helicopter noise and weapons fire and the general cacophony of places where things go wrong. "I am an active duty officer in the United States Army. My military identification is in the wallet you currently have in your left hand. I am requesting that you examine it before proceeding." Pruitt laughed. It was a short, harsh sound, dry as the Georgia heat. "Yeah, and I'm the Queen of England." He began the pat-down, his hands rough and invasive, hitting rather than touching. Shoulders, sides, waistband, thighs. He found nothing, a phone, a pack of spearmint gum, and a pocket knife that was within the legal blade length limit by a quarter inch. "Nice car. DC plates attitude. We know the type." He kicked Webb's ankles apart harder than necessary. Webb absorbed the impact without moving. "You're making a mistake," Webb said. His voice had dropped an octave, not in anger. In register, the voice he used when he needed to be heard clearly in environments that were very loud and very dangerous. The voice that his soldiers had learned to identify as the one that meant pay attention to this, exactly this right now. A very expensive mistake. "Shut up." Pruitt grabbed Webb's right wrist, wrenched it behind his back with the practiced efficiency of a man who had cuffed people before, and slapped the metal on. The ratchet clicked once, twice, biting into the skin above Webb's wrist bone. Then the left wrist. Another click, another two. He shoved Webb toward the cruiser. "You're under arrest. For what charge? Reckless driving. Disorderly conduct. Resisting arrest." I was traveling below the speed limit. I did not behave in a disorderly manner, and I complied with every instruction you gave. Tell it to the judge. Pruitt opened the rear door of the cruiser and put his hand on top of Webb's head, a gesture of practiced control, the kind of move that appears in every law enforcement training video as the correct technique for guiding a tall subject into a low vehicle, and which in this moment felt like the final insult of a long list and folded him into the back seat. Webb settled into the hard plastic of the rear compartment. The door slammed. The outside world went muffled and closed, the cicadas suddenly far away. He looked at his reflection in the tinted rear window as Pruitt walked back to the cruiser's front door. He didn't look angry. He looked, if anything, like a man who had just confirmed something he already knew. In the front seat, Pruitt keyed his radio with the offhand confidence of a man whose routine this was. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I got one in custody. Black male, non-compliant, bringing him in." A pause. "Oh, and have somebody call the impound. Got a vintage Charger on the shoulder of Route 9 near the Dairy Queen billboard. She's a beauty. Make sure they handle her carefully." He said that last part with a smile that Webb, watching in the rear window, could see clearly. Webb closed his eyes. He breathed in for 4 counts, held for 4, out for 4. The machine had just started. The Calhoun Falls Police Station had been built in 1974 with federal community development block grant money and had been renovated exactly once since then, in 2003, when somebody convinced the county commission to replace the carpet and repaint the walls. The carpet was now gray linoleum. The walls were now institutional beige. The building smelled with a persistence that defeated every cleaning product the department had ever applied to it, of floor wax and old cigarettes, and the particular staleness of a place where people spent time they did not want to spend. Pruitt brought Webb in through the back entrance, a heavy steel door off the parking lot that opened directly into the processing area. The fluorescent lights in the corridor hummed at a frequency just below the threshold of conscious awareness and just above the threshold of low-grade headache. Pruitt's hand was on Webb's shoulder, not guiding exactly, more demonstrating as he steered him past the evidence room and through the door into the booking area. Sergeant Ray Dobbs looked up from his desk. Dobbs was 56 years old with gray stubble on a face that had accumulated the specific kind of weathering that comes not from outdoor labor or sun exposure, but from years of looking the other way. He had kind eyes which had become a kind of cruelty in themselves over the past decade, because kind eyes attached to a man who had chosen complicity created a particular and distinctive form of moral injury in the people who encountered him. He was good at his job in every technical sense. His paperwork was immaculate. His filing system was the envy of 3 neighboring counties. He remembered every person who came through the booking desk, and he had the habit of asking after family members by name, which was not nothing. But he had not in 7 years asked Dale Pruitt a single question about the provenance of a single vehicle that moved through this department's impound process. He looked at Webb now. He took in the posture, back straight, despite the cuffs, chin-level, feet planted with the unhurried permanence of a man who is standing somewhere. He intends to still be standing tomorrow. He took in the watch on Webb's left wrist, a Breitling emergency matte black case, the kind of instrument that existed at the intersection of precision engineering and survival necessity, worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $12,000. He took in the complete and total absence of fear in Webb's expression. "What you got?" Trent Dobbs asked in the voice of a man who already didn't want to know. Speeder Pruitt said, opening the hinged section of the booking counter to steer Webb through. "Gave me lip. Car's too nice for a guy like him. Think he might be moving something." He lowered his voice in the way that men lower their voices when they want to communicate shared understanding without stating it. "That car on the shoulder is a '69 Charger RT Ray, fully restored. You know what that goes for at auction?" Dobbs looked at Webb. Webb looked at Dobbs. The look that passed between them was brief, but not nothing on Webb's side. The calm, level assessment of a man who has already decided what he thinks of this situation. On Dobbs's side, the quick sideways discomfort of a man who hasn't yet decided what he's going to do about what he's seeing. "Did you run the plates?" Dobbs asked. "System's slow tonight," Pruitt said. He hadn't run the plates. He never ran them before a stop. The plates were irrelevant to the decision he'd already made. "Uncuff him for processing," Dobbs said. Pruitt unlocked the cuffs. Webb brought his arms in front of him and rubbed his wrists. The skin above the right wrist bone was red where the cuff had bitten in. He looked at it with clinical interest as if it were evidence, which it was. Sergeant Webb said, his voice measured and clear. "My name is Colonel Marcus Webb. I am requesting permission to make my phone call immediately." The word colonel moved through the booking area the way a stone moves through still water. Dobbs blinked. Pruitt, dropping the cuffs onto the counter, made a dismissive sound in the back of his throat. "Says he's in the Army." Pruitt tossed Webb's wallet onto the counter with a lightness that suggested its contents were not something he'd found particularly impressive. Stolen valor. "Look at him, Ray. He looked like a colonel to you?" What Webb looked like in that moment was a man of considerable physical presence in civilian clothes who was waiting with infinite patience for the correct institutional procedure to take its course, which was not inconsistent with being a colonel, but was also not how Pruitt's mental model of a colonel looked, which required a uniform and a salute, and probably a different skin color. Dobbs picked up the wallet. He opened it with the careful deliberateness of a man who has learned not to rush past things that might matter. He flipped past the driver's license. He found the card behind it, the common access card, the military ID, the credential that every active duty member of the U.S. Armed Forces carries with the gold chip embedded in the upper right corner, and the clearance level indicators printed in a font small enough to require reading glasses, which Dobbs reached for now, without realizing he was reaching for them. He looked at the card for a moment that stretched. Then he said, "Trent." His voice had a quality it hadn't had 30 seconds ago. Something careful in it. Something that might have been the beginning of concern. "Book him," Pruitt said. He was already moving toward the coffee machine. He resisted, pulled away when I tried to cuff him. "I want it on the sheet." He resisted, Dobbs repeated. "I want it on the sheet," Pruitt said again without turning around. Dobbs looked at Webb. Webb looked at Dobbs. In the hallway that connected the booking area to the patrol room, Officer Caleb Hines, 26 years old, 14 months on the job, still in the phase of his career, where the gap between what he'd been trained to do and what he was watching happen produced physical discomfort, rather than just bureaucratic acceptance, was pretending to review a duty roster while watching everything. Dobbs put the ID down. He opened the intake form. He began to type. The processing took 20 minutes. Ink on the fingers. The mugshot, Webb stood in front of the height marker board with the same stillness he'd maintained throughout his face, a mask of composed neutrality that the camera captured with uncomfortable clarity. The documentation, Webb Marcus J. Case, number 771-A. The watch came off. Dobbs handled it with a care that was either professional or guilty, along with the phone and the gum and the pocket knife and the wallet. "I want my call," Webb said each time there was a pause in the processing. Calm, consistent, not demanding. Simply stating with the precision of a man who knows which rights he is entitled to exercise and is creating a record of each request. "You get your call when we're done," Pruitt said from behind his coffee. They walked him to the holding cell at the end of the corridor. It was a concrete box, 8 feet by 10 feet, which sounds larger than it feels when the ceiling is low, and the single light fixture in the center of the ceiling flickers at irregular intervals, and the metal bench along one wall has a weld seam running down the center that hits the back of the thigh at an angle specifically designed to become uncomfortable within 5 minutes. The toilet in the corner had not been cleaned recently. The drain in the floor was dark with something that had been dark for a while. The bars slid shut with a resonant clang that was the institutional equivalent of a period at the end of a sentence. Webb sat on the bench. He placed his feet flat on the floor. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at the wall across from him, which was the same institutional beige as every other wall in the building, and on which a previous occupant had scratched the words, "God sees," into the paint with something sharp. He breathed. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. This was something he'd learned in a hostage survival course at Fort Leavenworth, and it was the same thing he'd taught his soldiers before operations in environments where the primary danger was not physical but psychological. The danger of allowing fear or anger or desperation to overwhelm the thinking brain before the thinking brain had finished doing what it needed to do. He was not afraid. He was not angry. He was in the most technical sense of the word patient. The clock on the wall read 7:11 p.m. He had somewhere between 30 minutes and 2 hours before the situation corrected itself. The specifics of the correction were already in motion. He had identified what was happening, communicated what was happening to the correct authority, and now his primary responsibility was to do nothing that gave Pruitt additional cause for escalation. Webb was above all things a commander of men. Commanders of men understand that the most powerful thing a person can sometimes do in a volatile situation is nothing at all. He stared at the wall. The scratched words stared back at him. God sees. Marcus Webb was not a particularly religious man, but he allowed himself just for a moment the small satisfaction of agreeing with the sentiment. 40 minutes passed. Then Pruitt appeared at the bars. He was holding a can of soda orange, which he preferred, and he leaned his shoulder against the cell doorframe with the practiced ease of a man who had done this many times, the casual ownership of the powerful over a space they had created for the powerless. He looked at Webb the way a man looks at something he has caught and is deciding what to do with. "You comfortable, Colonel?" The honorific landed with the specific weight of a word being used as a weapon. Its form preserved, its meaning inverted. Officer Carver. Webb looked up from the wall without moving the rest of his body. Then he stopped because Pruitt's name was not Carver. Officer Pruitt, he corrected, his eyes flat and steady. You have violated 4 federal civil rights statutes and at least 1 provision of the Uniform Code of Military Justice regarding the unlawful detention of a superior officer. Every minute I remain in this cell increases the civil liability accruing against you personally and against this department. I am telling you this not as a threat, but as a factual description of the situation. Pruitt took a long pull of his soda. He looked at Webb with the expression of a man listening to something he finds both irritating and irrelevant. You ain't in the military right now, Colonel. You're in Calhoun Falls. This is my town. It isn't your town, Webb said quietly. It belongs to the United States of America, and you swore an oath to that same country when you put on that uniform. The oath you swore this evening is the one I want you to think about. Pruitt pushed off the doorframe. He was smiling the smile of a man who is no longer bothering to hide what he thinks because he doesn't believe it matters. Your car's going to the impound lot tonight. Dog unit comes tomorrow morning. If they don't find anything, and maybe they don't, maybe you're clean, we still got the civil forfeiture to work with. Car's registered to you. It was present at the scene of an arrest. That's enough to move it into the process. Takes about 6 weeks. By the time you get a lawyer and file a challenge, the auction's already scheduled. He paused, letting that information distribute itself through the cell. Nice car, by the way, he added. Real nice. Whoever did the restoration work knew what they were doing. I did, Webb said. 4 years. Pruitt's eyes flickered. Just for a moment, a flash of something that might have been surprise or might have been recalibration before the default expression reinstalled itself. He took another sip of soda. He looked at Webb for another 2 seconds. Then he walked away down the corridor, his footsteps echoing on the linoleum. Webb watched him go. He noted something that would matter later, that he filed away in the part of his mind that stored things for future use. When Pruitt had talked about the car, the impound, the forfeiture, the auction, the 6 weeks, he had not framed it as a legal procedure. He had framed it as an outcome. The car going through the process wasn't a consequence of what Pruitt suspected. It was the objective. The arrest was the mechanism to achieve the objective. Pruitt hadn't stopped him for speeding. Pruitt hadn't stopped him because he looked suspicious. Pruitt had stopped him because of what he was driving and everything else. The fabricated speed, the disorderly conduct charge. The non-compliant notation in the arrest report was scaffolding built around an intention that had existed before Pruitt ever pulled out of that turnout. This was not a corrupt cop conducting a racial stop. This was a corrupt cop conducting a robbery, and the racial profile was his method of identifying low-risk targets. Near the back of the booking area, Officer Caleb Hines sat at a desk and looked at nothing in particular. He had heard Pruitt's voice through the bars, had heard the tone of it familiar and proprietary, the tone of a man in a place he believes is his, and he had felt the same thing he'd been feeling for 14 months, which was a knot in his stomach that had gradually calcified into something he'd stopped noticing until moments like this, when something brought it back to the surface with unambiguous clarity. He was 26. He had joined the department because his uncle had been on the force in another county and had told him that local law enforcement was where you could actually make a difference in people's lives, actually know the community you served. He had not, in his uncle's telling, encountered a Dale Pruitt. He sat at his desk and looked at nothing and did not say anything. Behind the booking counter, Ray Dobbs quietly typed the name Marcus Webb into the law enforcement database that was shared across Georgia state and federal agencies. The result came back in 11 seconds. Dobbs looked at the screen for a long time. Then he minimized the window and sat very still, staring at the beige wall with the expression of a man who has just understood something he wishes he didn't understand. 93 minutes after the bars had clanged shut, Sergeant Ray Dobbs walked down the corridor and stopped in front of the holding cell. He was carrying his own personal ring of keys, rather than the duty keys, a small distinction that Webb noted without comment. His face had the look of a man who has spent an hour and a half arguing with himself and has arrived at a decision, though not comfortably and not without cost. "Come on," Dobbs said. His voice was lower than it had been at the booking desk. Quieter. "You can make your call." Webb stood. He moved to the cell door with the unhurried precision that was becoming, Dobbs would reflect later, the most unnerving thing about the man. He did not rush at the opportunity. He did not express gratitude or relief. He simply stood up and walked to the door as though he had been waiting for Dobbs to arrive at exactly the correct moment and had never doubted that he would. Dobbs unlocked the cell and stepped aside. They walked back to the booking area together in silence. Pruitt was at his desk, feet up, scrolling through something on his phone, with the relaxed self-satisfaction of a man who has had a productive day. He looked up when Webb appeared. He looked at Dobbs. A flicker of something moved across his face, not alarm exactly, more the mildly proprietary irritation of someone whose arrangement has been altered without consultation. "What's this?" he said. "He gets a call." Trent Dobbs said. He did not look at Pruitt when he said it. "You just said, he gets a call." Dobbs placed the station phone on the edge of the booking counter. A heavy desk unit, institutional gray, the kind of phone that still had a coiled cord. He looked at Webb. "Local calls. That's the policy." Sergeant Webb said, "This is a matter of national security. I will be dialing a Washington, D.C. area code. If you prevent me from completing that call, your name will be included in the federal kidnapping complaint as a co-conspirator in the unlawful detention of a member of the armed forces. I am informing you of this so that you can make an informed decision." Dobbs swallowed. He looked at the phone. He looked at Webb. He did not look at Pruitt, though he could hear Pruitt beginning to say something from across the room. "Make your call," Dobbs said. He stepped back. Webb picked up the receiver. He dialed from memory a number that was not in any public directory, and that connected through two automated authentication layers before reaching a human being. He had memorized it because there were things in his line of work that you kept in your head rather than in a device because devices could be taken from you. Pruitt rolled his chair back and tilted his head with the theatrical skepticism of a man performing disbelief for an audience. "Sierra Tango, give me a break," he said to no one in particular. "Who's he calling?" "That's a OD number format. Probably calling Fort Benning's complaint line." He looked at Hines, who was watching from the edge of the room. $10 says he hangs up in 30 seconds. The line clicked through, a professional female voice clipped and impersonal. "This is the Fort Gordon Operations Desk. Secure authentication required," Sierra Whiskey 19er Webb said. "Authentication code Ironwood Black. I need a direct connect to Major General Cross. This is a priority red contact." Pruitt's feet came off the desk. He didn't move. He sat very still with his feet on the floor and his soda can in his hand, and his expression shifting through a sequence of states. First, the smirk of a man watching someone perform, then a kind of suspended assessment, then a flicker of something that was not quite concern, but was adjacent to it. "Hold one, Colonel," said the voice. 10 seconds of silence. In the booking area, the fluorescent hum was the only sound. Then a new voice came on the line. A voice that did not belong to an automated system or a duty operator. A voice that had the quality of a man who had spent 3 decades being heard in large rooms and did not waste volume because he had learned that authority, genuine authority, does not need to announce itself. "Marcus, I've got you on the Fort Gordon Secure Board. You're supposed to be at my door at 0800 tomorrow." "What's your status?" Sir Webb said. He kept his voice level and professional because this was a work call and he was a professional, and also because keeping his voice level was the correct approach to a situation in which he was standing handcuffed in a county holding facility in Georgia while 2 police officers listened to him speak to a 2-star general. "I have been unlawfully detained by the Calhoun Falls Police Department in Georgia. I was stopped without probable cause, assaulted during the arrest process, charged with fabricated offenses, and am currently being held in a cell. Additionally, my personal vehicle, a 1969 Charger RT Virginia registration, has been impounded under what the arresting officer has explicitly described as a civil forfeiture action, intended to facilitate its auction for his personal financial benefit." A silence followed this statement. Not the silence of a man who is surprised, the silence of a man who is deciding the shape of his response to something that has already fully formed in his understanding. "Are you injured?" General Cross said. "Negative. Minor abrasions to both wrists from the cuffing procedure. Nothing requiring medical attention. The officers are present, yes, sir." The arresting officer, a sergeant at the booking desk, and 1 other are in the room. "All right." Cross's voice had gone to a register that Webb recognized, the pre-operation register, the voice of a man transitioning from the civilian setting of his own feelings to the professional setting of a problem to be solved. "Put the phone down, Marcus. Do not make any additional statements. I am contacting the FBI field office in Atlanta, the Judge Advocate General's Corps, the Georgia Governor's Office, and the Secretary of Defense's liaison to state law enforcement. You have my word that within the hour this situation will have changed fundamentally." "Understood." "Yes, sir." A pause. "General." "Yes, Marcus. They have the charger." A beat. "We'll get the charger, son. Now, put the phone down." "Understood, sir." Webb set the receiver back in its cradle with the gentle, deliberate care of a man who does not make unnecessary noise. He turned from the phone and faced the room. Pruitt was sitting with his soda can resting on his knee and his feet flat on the floor, and his face in the particular expression of a man who has just heard something that doesn't fit any of his existing categories, but has decided for the time being to treat it as belonging to a category called bluff. Webb crossed his arms. He looked at the wall clock. 8:44 p.m. "Officer Pruitt," he said, and his voice carried in the quiet room with the ease of something that was not trying. "If I were you, I would spend the next 20 minutes thinking very carefully about the decisions that brought you to this specific moment." Pruitt put his feet back up on his desk. "Done snitching." "Completely," Webb said. "Now I'm just waiting." The station phone rang at 9:02 p.m. Dobbs answered it the way he answered every call. Calhoun Falls Police Department Sergeant Dobbs speaking, and then the phone appeared to transform into something else in his hand, because after the first 4 seconds of listening, he pulled it slightly away from his ear, as if it had increased in temperature. And then he brought it back, and then the color left his face in the systematic visible way that blood leaves a face when the brain has just received news of significant consequence. "Yes, sir," Dobbs said. "Yes, sir." "I understand. Yes, sir, right away." He set the phone down. He looked at it for a moment the way you look at something that has just demonstrated an unexpected property. Then he stood up. He crossed the booking area to Pruitt's desk and stood in front of it. "Trent," he said. Pruitt was in the process of opening a bag of peanuts from his desk drawer. He looked up with the mild annoyance of a man interrupted in the middle of something enjoyable. "Yeah." "That was the governor's office." Pruitt put a peanut in his mouth and chewed. "The governor's office?" "Yes." "The governor of Georgia's office?" "Yes." Pruitt looked at Dobbs for a long moment. Then he looked at Webb, who was sitting on the bench in the booking area. Pruitt had declined to put him back in the cell after the phone call, which was either a concession or a miscalculation, and in the context of everything that followed, it turned out to be both. Webb was sitting with his hands on his knees and his back straight and looking at the wall clock with the abstract attention of a man watching a pot that he is entirely certain will boil. "The governor called this station," Pruitt said. "His office did," Dobbs said. "His chief of staff. He said the Secretary of Defense contacted the governor directly." He said Dobbs stopped. He looked as if choosing words carefully. He said we need to release the individual in custody immediately and without further delay. He used those words, immediately and without further delay. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Pruitt cracked a peanut shell against the edge of his desk. "It's a bluff, Trent." "It's a bluff, Ray." Pruitt ate the peanut with deliberate calm. He looked at Webb with an expression that had reconfigured itself into something specific. The expression of a man who has made the decision to be unmoved and is now performing that decision for himself as much as for any audience. This guy, whoever he is, Army or not, he's got a friend. A friend who knows a staffer. The staffer made a call. Nobody calls the governor of Georgia over a traffic stop. Nobody. The Secretary of Defense has better things to do than... The Secretary of Defense, Dobbs said quietly. "On a Thursday evening." "It's a bluff," Pruitt said again. The third repetition landed differently from the first two, with a slight increase in the force behind it, the quality of a statement becoming a choice rather than a conclusion. "These guys, they try this. They know somebody they name drop. They think we're going to fall over ourselves to let them walk. We've seen it before." "We haven't seen it before," Dobbs said. "Not from the governor's office. Not with the Secretary of Defense's name." Pruitt stood up. He walked to the coffee machine and poured himself a mug, even though the coffee had been sitting for 4 hours, and tasted accordingly. He turned back to the room. He looked at Webb. Webb looked back at him. The expression on Webb's face had not changed since he sat down. It had the quality of something geological, not cold, not hostile, just permanent. The expression of a man who is not waiting for the situation to change because he already knows when and approximately how it will change and is simply occupying the interim, Heinz Pruitt said. The rookie looked up from the desk where he'd been staring at an open report form for the better part of an hour. "Yeah, go down to the impound lot. Make sure the charger's documented. VIN condition report the whole thing. I want the paperwork started tonight." Hines looked at Pruitt. He looked at Dobbs, who had his head slightly turned, not quite looking at Hines, but angled toward him in a way that communicated something. He looked at Webb. Webb did not look at him. Webb was looking at the clock. "Yeah," Hines said. He stood up. He put his jacket on. He walked to the door. He paused in the doorway. "Pruitt." His voice was quiet. "The governor's office." "That's not nothing. Go do the paperwork, Caleb." Hines went. Pruitt sat back down at his desk. He put his feet up again. He picked up his phone. He scrolled for a moment and then put it down because he was not actually reading what was on the screen. He was performing the posture of a man who is unconcerned and performing it for an audience of one. Webb watched the second hand on the wall clock make its circuit. Officer Pruitt Webb said, "I told you to be quiet. I'm informing you that, in my estimation, you have approximately 40 minutes before the situation in this station changes in ways that will be difficult to recover from. I am telling you this not because I expect you to act on it, but because when this is over and you are attempting to reconstruct how it happened, I want you to know that you were given the information clearly and in time." Pruitt's jaw tightened. He didn't respond. "You were given it clearly," Webb repeated, "and in time." The clock moved. The fluorescent lights hummed. The station was quiet except for the distant sound of Hines's boots on gravel somewhere outside. Dobbs sat at his desk and did not open any windows on his computer and did not read any paperwork. He sat with his hands flat on the desk surface and his eyes on the middle distance with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a bus that he now understands he missed a long time ago. Pruitt was not a man who doubted himself. This was something he had achieved through careful curation of his environment over 7 years, surrounding himself with people who deferred to him, eliminating situations that required him to be wrong, and developing a relationship with his own judgment that was less like trust and more like ideology. But there was something about the man on the bench in his booking area that had been producing a low, persistent frequency of unease since the moment the Charger's window had rolled down and those flat, dark eyes had looked directly at him, without a trace of the fear that Pruitt had come to understand as his due. He suppressed the unease the way he always suppressed inconvenient information by doing something. He keyed his radio from the desk. "Hines. You at the lot." "Yeah, I'm here." Hines's voice came back with the slight compression of the radio. He sounded unhappy, which he nearly always did lately. "Run the VIN through NCIC. I want to check for theft reports." A pause. "It's a 49-year-old car, Pruitt. The theft database goes back." "Just run it, Caleb." Another pause. Longer. "Running it." Pruitt sat with his coffee and his satisfaction and waited. The VIN check would take 3 minutes. Whatever it returned would give him another layer of documentation, another official notation that he had followed procedure, that he had had legitimate reasons for every step of the process. Documentation was armor. Pruitt had spent 7 years building armor. The radio crackled. "It's clean," Hines said. "Virginia registration. Owner of record is—" A longer pause this time. Long enough that Pruitt actually lifted his head from his phone. "Marcus J. Webb, Charlottesville, Virginia." "Okay," Pruitt said. "Start the impound form." "Already done." Hines's voice had something in it. Not defiance. Hines didn't have defiance exactly, not yet, but a quality of statement like a period at the end of a sentence. "I printed it. I'm keeping a copy." Pruitt frowned at the radio. "Why are you keeping a copy?" "Procedure," Hines said. Pruitt looked at the radio for a moment. Then he shrugged and put it down. He walked back to the holding area, not because he needed to. He had already said everything he needed to say. He went because the act of walking back was itself a communication, a statement that he was still moving through this space freely, that it was still his space, that the phone call from the governor's office and the man on the bench and the specific feeling of unease that had been running under the surface of his confidence for the past hour had not changed the fundamental reality of who was in charge in this building. He stopped in front of the booking area bench. Webb looked up at him with the expression that Pruitt had decided he hated most about this entire encounter. Not anger, not hostility, not even contempt, but a kind of patient, settled observation, like a scientist watching a reaction proceed. "Dog units coming at dawn," Pruitt said. "Even if they don't find anything on the car, and I got a feeling they might. Funny how that happens. Sometimes the forfeiture paperwork's already filed. 6 weeks minimum before a court hears a challenge. You'll need an attorney. Attorneys cost money. The auction's already scheduled for 2 weeks from Tuesday." He paused. "Unless you want to talk to me now. Save everybody some time." Webb looked at him for a moment. "What would talking to you accomplish? Might be we could work something out." "What kind of something?" Pruitt smiled. It was the smile of a man offering a transaction he has offered before. "Car's worth, what, 40–50,000. For a private sale. At auction, my brother's company is the primary bidder, so he tends to get things at a discount. But if the original owner wanted to negotiate before it went through the process, you're asking me to pay you to release my property that you have unlawfully seized." "I'm describing options," Pruitt said. Webb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I understand. Thank you for clarifying." There was something in the way he said it that made Pruitt stop smiling. Not a threat, not sarcasm, something more like completion, the satisfaction of a man who has just received the final piece of information he needed. "You're making a mistake," Webb said. "The same mistake you've been making for years with different people who didn't have the means or the standing to hold you accountable for it. The mechanism exists, Officer Pruitt. It has always existed. You've been lucky that the people you've used it against didn't have access to it. That ends tonight." Pruitt stared at him. "You talk a lot for a man in a holding cell. And you've said very little for a man whose future just changed completely," Webb said. "Go on. I'll be right here." Pruitt walked back to his desk. He sat down. He picked up his phone. He put it down. He picked up the coffee. He put that down too. The clock on the wall read 9:34 p.m., and then the coffee mug on Dobbs's desk began to vibrate. It started in the floor. Not a sound, not yet. Not exactly. A sensation. A low, rhythmic tremor moving up through the linoleum, through the institutional metal legs of the booking desk, through the chairs, through the bodies of the people in the room. The kind of vibration that registers in the chest cavity before the ears, sorted into anything meaningful. The coffee mugs moved. Dobbs, then the one on Heinz's desk, then the ceramic pencil holder near the duty roster board. Little circular ripples on the liquid surfaces appearing and spreading and disappearing and reappearing faster now. A sustained, growing tremor. Then the windows began to shake. The fluorescent tube in the far corner of the booking area, the one that had been flickering intermittently for 6 months because nobody had filed the maintenance request, buzzed loud and then went dark. The American flag outside the station's front entrance, visible through the glass of the front door, snapped suddenly rigid and then began to move in a way that had nothing to do with wind. "What is that?" Dobbs was on his feet without realizing he'd stood up. "Storm front," Pruitt said, but he didn't sound convinced. His voice had the quality of a man saying the first reasonable thing that came to mind because the unreasonable thing hadn't formed yet into a shape he could name. "That's not a storm front," Dobbs said. He was moving toward the window. In the booking area, Webb stood up from the bench. He straightened his shirt with 2 careful movements. He put his feet together and stood with the particular quality of stillness that had characterized him since the beginning, except that now the stillness had a direction to it, like a compass pointing. "That is a UH-60 Blackhawk," he said. His voice was completely calm. By the sound of the rotor frequency and the acoustic signature, I'd say 2 of them, possibly 3. There's a secondary harmonic that could indicate a third aircraft at about a half-mile separation, but that might also be ground vehicle exhaust resonance. It's difficult to tell through this structure. Pruitt was on his feet now. His chair rolled back and hit the filing cabinet. He crossed to the window fast, his boots loud on the linoleum. He looked out. Route 9 was blocked, not by a traffic incident or a mechanical failure or the kind of random obstruction that occurred on county roads at inconvenient times. It was blocked deliberately with the efficient precision of people who had done this before in environments considerably more dangerous than a county police station in Georgia. 4 black Chevrolet Suburbans with federal plates were arranged across the road in a formation that allowed no vehicle to pass in either direction. They had come in fast and stopped in coordination, their doors opening before the vehicles fully stopped, men in tactical gear flowing out of them with the organized energy of water released through a breach. The men were wearing black plate carriers with identifying letters front and back, FBI in bright yellow, DOD in white, and they moved with the low economical efficiency of people who were not performing urgency but were actually urgent. 2 of them moved immediately to Pruitt's cruiser in the parking lot and established a position at the rear. 2 more placed themselves on either side of the front entrance. A vehicle identification unit, 1 man, a camera, began documenting the lot. And on Route 9 itself, its rotary wash flattening the grass on both shoulders into flat, pale circles, a UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter held a steady hover at 50 feet. The spotlight mounted under its nose was lit. It was pointed at the front entrance of the Calhoun Falls police station. The beam was white and absolute, and it turned the parking lot into something between a crime scene and a stage set. A second helicopter was visible further south, holding a wider orbit, its running lights pulsing red and green in the dark. The American flag on the pole in front of the station was now completely horizontal, held rigid by rotor wash extended at full length as if making a point. Pruitt stared through the window. His face had gone through pink and red and was now in the territory of gray, the specific gray of a man whose understanding of a situation is revising itself so rapidly that the physiological responses can't keep pace. "Lock the door," he said. His voice was wrong too high, the breath behind it too shallow. "Quinn Dobbs, lock the door. Lock it right now." "Are you insane?" Dobbs was standing behind him, also looking through the window, his voice shaking in a different register, the register of a man who is frightened but has just made a decision about what he is frightened of. "I am not locking the federal government out of this building, Trent. I am not doing that. That could be, those could be." "Look at the aircraft," Dobbs said. "Look at the insignia on the vehicles. That is United States Army Military Police. That is the FBI." Hines had come back in from the lot. He was standing in the doorway to the parking area, his face pale, holding the impound paperwork he'd printed, which was now creased where his hand had tightened around it. He looked at Pruitt. He looked at Dobbs. He looked at Webb. Webb had not looked at the window. He was looking at the front door. He was waiting. The front door of the Calhoun Falls police station opened the way doors open when the people opening them are not concerned with the hardware. It hit the interior wall with a crack that sent a fracture line through the plaster at the point of impact, a sound like a rifle shot in the enclosed space of the booking area, and then it stayed open, held by the rotor wash and by the weight of what was coming through it. 4 men entered in a file. The first 2 in tactical gear rifles at the low ready, scanning the room with the systematic professional attention of people clearing a space rather than entering one. Their eyes moved in coordinated arcs, door corners, left depth, right depth, center, and one of them said, clear in a voice calibrated for the room and the radio simultaneously. Behind them came a man in a United States Army dress uniform. Major General Leonard Cross was 61 years old and had the physical bearing of a man who had spent those years doing things that the people around him could not do. He was 6 feet 2 broad through the chest in a way that the dress jacket could not entirely conceal. with hair the color of steel wool, cut close on the sides, and the kind of face that looked like it had been assembled from material chosen specifically for its resistance to the elements. The two silver stars on each shoulder caught the fluorescent light of the booking area and threw it back with an authority that was almost architectural. He walked through the door without pausing. He did not look at Pruitt. He did not look at Dobbs. He did not look at Hines, who had pressed himself against the wall near the duty desk with the expression of a man trying to become part of the wallpaper. He looked for Marcus Webb. He found him standing near the booking bench, back straight, hands at his sides, and the expression that crossed General Cross's face in the 2 seconds before it reassembled itself was something that the people in that room would each remember differently. Dobbs would later describe it as relief. Hines would say it looked like grief. Pruitt in the years that followed would not describe it at all. Cross walked directly to Webb. He took in the red marks above Webb's wrists. He looked at them for exactly the amount of time it took to fully register their existence and their cause, and then he turned. When he turned, he was no longer looking at Marcus Webb. He was looking at the room, and the room was looking back at him, the way rooms look back at things that have come into them, with the authority to change everything in them. "Who is the officer in charge?" General Cross said. The volume was moderate. The room was quiet enough that moderate volume filled it completely. He asked the question in the tone of a man who already knows the answer and is offering the person who holds it the opportunity to identify themselves. Dobbs raised his hand. The gesture was instinctive, the gesture of a schoolboy which was not appropriate to the moment but was honest. "Sergeant Ray Dobbs, sir. The chief is on his way. He was called 40 minutes ago." Sergeant Dobbs. Cross looked at him with the full attention of a man who has assessed human beings in high-stakes environments for 3 decades. "I am Major General Leonard Cross, Joint Special Operations Command. The individual to my left is Special Agent Dana Merritt of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Public Corruption Unit, Atlanta Field Office." He gestured slightly to his right without looking away from Dobbs. "You are currently holding a high-level strategic asset of the United States government. You have approximately 5 seconds to explain to me the nature and basis of that detention before I begin the process of condemning this facility and placing every individual in this room under federal arrest for conspiracy to commit unlawful detention of a military officer." He was not speaking loudly. He was not performing anger. This was in its way more frightening than if he had been. Pruitt stepped forward. 7 years of inhabiting a role that nobody in this county had ever seriously challenged was a difficult thing to surrender, and Dale Pruitt's personality was not configured for surrender. His arrogance was not a pose, it was structural load-bearing, the thing that held everything else up. Remove it, and there was no Pruitt left in any functional sense. So he stepped forward. "Now hold on." His voice had the quality of a man trying to inject authority into a situation where he has none left but hasn't processed this yet. "You can't just, this is a municipal facility. You can't enter without Officer Pruitt." General Cross said, "He said it the way you say a fact." Pruitt stopped. "How do you know I know your name because Agent Merritt has been compiling a file on you for 9 months, Cross said. "She knows considerably more about you than your name. You will hear about it shortly." He turned back to Dobbs. "Unlock the Colonel. Now." Pruitt's jaw worked. "I have to process the unlock him, Trent." Dobbs was already moving his keys out, moving past Pruitt with the determination of a man crossing a line he has been standing at the edge of for a very long time. His hands shook. He dropped the keys. He picked them up. He dropped them again. Hines crossed the room and picked them up for him and handed them back without a word. The cuffs clicked open. Webb brought his arms forward and rolled his wrists once slowly in each direction. He looked at the marks on his skin with the same clinical attention as before. Then he looked at General Cross. "Good to see you, sir," he said. "I apologize for the disruption to the schedule." "Not your disruption to apologize for," Cross said. He glanced at Webb's wrists. His expression did not change, but something moved behind it. "Are you injured, minor?" "Wrist abrasions from the cuffing procedure." A pause. "I was recuffed after the initial booking. The arresting officer did it after the governor's call." The temperature in the room dropped 2 degrees. Cross turned to look at Pruitt. He had not looked at Pruitt since entering the building. Now he did. The full attention of a man who had directed operations in 4 combat theaters settled on Dale Pruitt of the Calhoun Falls Police Department, and Pruitt experienced something he had never experienced before in his adult life, which was the physical sensation of being completely, structurally, irrevocably outranked in every dimension that mattered. Agent Merritt, who had been standing at Cross's left and speaking into a low-profile earpiece, closed a notebook she had been writing in, and looked up at the room with eyes that moved with the efficient precision of someone who has already assessed everyone in it and assigned each of them a category. She was 43, with sharp features behind wire-rimmed glasses and the specific compact energy of someone who functions best when there is a large amount of work to be done. She had a folder under her left arm. She had been carrying it since she walked through the door. "Colonel Webb," she said. Her voice was professionally pleasant in the way of someone who is pleased by the work, not by the theater. "I'm Special Agent Dana Merritt, FBI Public Corruption Unit. I need to ask you to make a formal statement about this evening's events before we proceed, if you're able." "I'm able," Webb said. At this moment, the front door opened again. Chief Gordon Falk came through it, tucking his shirt in with the frantic energy of a man who drove faster than the speed limit getting here because he knew that arriving late was the only variable he could still control. He stopped inside the doorway and looked at the room. He took in the general, the FBI agent, the military police, the tactical team, the man they'd apparently had in their holding cell. He looked at Pruitt. Pruitt looked at the floor. Falk looked at Merritt's folder. He looked at it for a long time. Then he sat down heavily in the chair nearest the door, as if he had decided that his legs were no longer going to be part of this evening's proceedings, and it was better to address that before they made the decision for him. Dobbs stood with the open handcuffs in his hand and the expression of a man who has just completed a task and is not sure what to do with the residue of it. He looked at the cuffs. He looked at Webb. He set them on the booking counter with a small, precise sound. Webb rolled his wrists once more. He straightened his shirt. He looked at General Cross with the focused attention of 2 professionals establishing a shared understanding of a shared situation. "Sir," he said, "I need to give Agent Merritt a complete account. In order to give her the complete account, I need to tell her about the conversation I had with Officer Pruitt in the booking area approximately 90 minutes ago, in which he described in specific terms his intention to seize my vehicle through a civil forfeiture process and facilitate its sale to a shell company operated by his brother." The word brother moved through the room like a current. Agent Merritt opened her folder. Chief Falk in the chair by the door closed his eyes. "I was also assaulted during the arrest." Webb continued. His voice had the quality of a formal statement being made for the record, which it was. Specifically, I was kicked in the ankles with sufficient force to separate my feet beyond a reasonable compliance distance while being restrained, and the handcuffs were applied above the wrist rather than at it on both arms, producing the abrasions you can see here. He held out his arms slightly. Additionally, I was denied my phone call for approximately 90 minutes in violation of established procedure. Merritt's pen moved, and after the phone call, Merritt asked. Officer Pruitt reapplied the restraints, described it as standard practice for an unprocessed detainee. The original cuffs were removed by Sergeant Dobbs for the booking process. Officer Pruitt reapplied them after the booking was complete after I had made my call and while we were waiting in the booking area. "Why did he reapply them at that point?" Merritt asked. Webb looked at Pruitt. "I believe Officer Pruitt can answer that." Pruitt said nothing. He had backed up until he was standing against the far wall, the filing cabinet at his right elbow, the duty roster board at his left. He was not cornered. Technically, there was floor on all sides of him, but he had the posture of a man who has run out of space in a way that has nothing to do with floor plan. Officer Pruitt Cross said. His voice had not changed in volume or register since he walked through the door. It was the voice of a man who has said things in much louder environments and learned that volume is the resort of people who don't have the authority to be heard without it. Agent Merritt has a question for you. I recuffed him because he was an uncompliant detainee, Pruitt said. The words came out with a kind of mechanical confidence, the confidence of a man reciting the version of events he intends to present, the version he has used before and found sufficient. He made threatening statements. He claimed to be a colonel, Merritt said pleasantly, and then turned out to be one. She made a note. And during the period you had him in the holding cell, you visited the cell on at least one occasion. Sergeant Dobbs, is that correct? Yes, Dobbs said. His voice was very quiet. During that visit, did Officer Pruitt make any statements regarding the disposition of Colonel Webb's vehicle? Dobbs looked at the ceiling. He looked at Pruitt. He looked at Merritt. He looked like a man who had arrived at a doorway that he had been approaching for a very long time and had finally run out of corridor. Yes, Dobbs said. Pruitt made a sound half-word, half-something else. Ray, he stated that the vehicle would go through the impound and civil forfeiture process, Dobbs said, and that the auction was already scheduled. Dobbs stopped. His jaw worked. He stated that the auction house was his brother's operation, that the bidding would be managed. He described the approximate auction value. The room was completely silent. Hines at the back wall had his face turned away. He was looking at the duty roster board as if it contained information of great importance. Chief Falk had his head in his hands. At that moment, Gordon Falk committed the act that would become the defining moment of his professional life in all the ways he had never intended to be defined. He looked up at Merritt at the folder she was holding at the tab visible on the edge of the second document, which was an auction approval form with a signature on it. And he said, I want to speak to my attorney before I make any statements. It was the right thing to say legally. It was also the most obvious admission possible in this particular room at this particular moment, and everyone in the room heard it as such. Merritt nodded with the professional pleasantness that had not left her face since she walked through the door. Of course, Chief Falk. You'll have that opportunity. Agent Torres will facilitate that. She made a small gesture, and a second agent who had been standing near the front entrance moved toward Falk. Webb watched all of this with the calm, total attention of a man who has achieved the objective and is now documenting the completion. Gentlemen, Agent Merritt set her folder on the booking counter. She did not open it yet. She looked at the room with the particular patience of someone who has been building toward this moment for a long time and is not in any rush to get past it because she has learned that when you rush past a moment like this, you miss things. I'd like to explain some context, she said. Colonel Webb, you're welcome to hear this. It's your case. Sergeant Dobbs, Officer Hines, Chief Falk, you'll each be interviewed individually later tonight. Officer Pruitt. She looked at him with an attention that was the opposite of casual. You especially need to hear this. She opened the folder. The FBI's Public Corruption Unit opened a file on Calhoun Falls Police Department 14 months ago, she said. The initial referral came from the Georgia Attorney General's office, which had received 3 separate complaints from civil forfeiture attorneys in Atlanta who had noticed an anomalous pattern in this county's vehicle seizure records. We spent 2 months on preliminary analysis before opening a full investigation 9 months ago. She pulled out the first document. It was a spreadsheet printed large enough to read from 6 feet away. 138 vehicles seized under civil forfeiture by Calhoun Falls PD over a 6-year period. I want to draw your attention to a few columns. She placed the document on the counter and tapped it with one finger. Column D, race of the driver at the time of seizure. 87% are identified in the arrest documentation as Black or Latino. Column F, plate state. 94% out of state. Column G, estimated vehicle value at time of seizure. The average value is $31,000. The median is $28,000. The lowest value seizure in the entire dataset is $9,000, which suggests a minimum threshold below which Officer Pruitt did not consider the effort worthwhile. Pruitt's face had achieved a perfect stillness, the kind of stillness that is the absence of expression rather than the presence of calm. Column J, merit continued, is the auction result. 100% of contested auctions in this dataset, 100% were won by bidders operating under 3 shell company names: Georgia Vehicle Recovery Partners, Halton Asset Management, Blue Ridge Auto Consortium. She paused. These 3 entities share a registered agent in Augusta, a P.O. Box address, and more significantly, they share a beneficial owner. She pulled out a second document, a corporate registration filed with the Georgia Secretary of State. Kyle Pruitt, Dale's brother. Current address 14 Olmsted Lane, Augusta, Georgia. She let that settle. The bidding pattern across these auctions demonstrates coordination, she continued. We have bank records showing regular transfers between accounts registered to the 3 shell companies and a personal account held jointly by Kyle Pruitt and his wife. We have email communications between Kyle and Dale Pruitt discussing specific vehicles, bid amounts, and distribution of proceeds. One such email, she pulled it out and set it on the counter, reads, "Got the Beamer coming Thursday. Keep the bid under 16. I already told Halton to sit this one out. Scratched the bumper so it looks worse." She looked at Pruitt. The BMW in question was a 2021 model worth $42,000 at auction. It sold for $15,800. The previous owner was a black architect from Charlotte who was stopped on Route 9 by Officer Pruitt for a fabricated lane departure. The room was very quiet. Over 6 years, Merritt said this operation extracted approximately $1.4 million in value from the people it targeted. The people it targeted were in 94% of cases driving through this county. In most cases, they did not have local legal representation, did not know the specific procedures for challenging a civil forfeiture in Georgia State Court, and did not have the resources or the standing to mount an effective challenge against a law enforcement agency in the jurisdiction where the seizure occurred. She closed the folder. That is the operation you built, Officer Pruitt. Tonight, when you stopped Colonel Webb, you were not doing something new. You were doing the same thing you have done 138 times before, to people who did not have access to the mechanism that would have stopped you. Pruitt's jaw was working, but no sound was coming out. Chief Falk had his attorney on the phone. He was speaking in a very low voice near the front window. Dobbs was sitting in his chair with his hands flat on his desk and his eyes on the middle distance, looking like a man who has just watched the building he's been standing in for 20 years slowly reveal that it was not what he thought it was and is not sure where to go from here. Hines at the back wall had taken out the copy of the impound form he'd printed in the parking lot. He set it on the nearest desk quietly without being asked. Merritt looked at it. She looked at him. Something in her assessment shifted slightly. "Officer Hines, I'll want to speak with you separately." "I know," he said. "I'll tell you everything I know." It was Pruitt who demanded the search. It was the last play available to him, and he knew it was the last play, and he ran it anyway because that is what men like Dale Pruitt do when the architecture of their invulnerability collapses. They look for the one remaining structure they can run to, and they run to it even when it's already burning. "Search the car," he said. His voice had taken on a desperate forward quality, the quality of a man pushing towards something because he can't afford to stop moving. "You want to know why I stopped him?" Agent Merritt. "I stopped him because I had reasonable suspicion. I smelled marijuana when I approached the vehicle. That's probable cause for a search. And if you search that car and find controlled substances, then everything I did tonight is fully justified, and this whole—" "You smelled marijuana," Webb said. He had not moved from his position near the booking bench. His voice was entirely level. "From outside the car, through a closed window, with your own windows rolled up while driving. Yes? I do not smoke," Webb said. "I have not smoked anything in my life. My car smells of leather conditioner and high-octane fuel. The interior is clean. I drove it off the restoration lift 2 weeks ago." General Cross looked at Merritt. Merritt looked at Cross. Something passed between them, the efficient, compressed communication of two professionals who have worked together long enough to have a shared language of glances. "All right," Cross said. He turned to the two military police officers standing near the door. "Escort Officer Pruitt to the colonel's vehicle. He may conduct his search. Film everything, every movement, every surface, every moment Officer Pruitt is within arm's reach of that vehicle." Pruitt looked at Cross. He looked at the two MPs who were large men with the particular quality of stillness that comes from extensive training in managing situations exactly like this one. He looked at the FBI agent who was already holding a video camera. He looked at Webb. Webb reached into the pocket of his jeans. The items from his pockets had been returned when the cuffs came off, and produced his car keys. He tossed them to Pruitt in a single, smooth arc. Pruitt caught them reflexively. "Go ahead," Webb said. They went outside into the heat of the night. The parking lot was still lit by the helicopter's spotlight, which had shifted its angle slightly to illuminate the Charger, where it sat on the far side of the lot, the impound truck having moved it at Heinz's direction from Route 9 earlier in the evening. It sat under the light, looking if anything more beautiful than it had on the roadside, the slate-black paint deep and dimensional under the artificial white of the spotlight, the chrome catching and throwing light in precise, narrow lines. Pruitt walked towards it. The two MPs flanked him at a distance of roughly 6 feet, moving with the relaxed professional attention of escort details that have escorted people who were considerably more dangerous than a county cop who knew he was finished. The FBI agent walked behind camera running. Pruitt opened the passenger door. He leaned into the car. He ran his hand under the passenger seat. He opened the glove box, the registration clean and current, and a folded American flag in a triangular case, the kind presented at military funerals, the kind that means something specific to the people who receive them. He opened the center console. Charging cable, a folded topographic map, a protein bar. He closed the console. He moved to the rear. He opened the rear door and checked under the seat. He popped the trunk, an immaculate trunk with a spare tire, a jack, a first aid kit, and a canvas bag containing the tools specific to the car's restoration, each wrapped in protective cloth. Nothing. He stood at the open trunk, sweating through his uniform shirt in the night heat, the spotlight above him, remorseless and total. He was breathing harder than the physical exertion of the search warranted. He was sweating more than the august heat accounted for. His right hand moved toward his vest pocket. One of the MPs said quietly and without inflection, "Don't." It was a single word. It carried in it everything: the camera, the witnesses, the federal jurisdiction, the 9 months of investigation, the 138 vehicles, the specific and terminal nature of what adding evidence tampering to the existing charge sheet would do to the next several decades of his life. Pruitt's hand stopped. It stayed where it was for 2 full seconds, the 2 seconds in which a man stands at the exact edge of a decision that cannot be undone, and then it came out of his vest empty. He closed the trunk. He stood beside the Charger under the spotlight, and he looked at the car, and the car looked back at him, the way beautiful things look back at people who have tried to take them for the wrong reasons, with the absolute indifference of something that has outlasted the intention. Agent Merritt walked out of the station. She came across the lot at her regular pace, the pace of someone who is never in a hurry because they are always prepared. She stopped beside the car and looked at Pruitt. "Find anything." "Officer Pruitt?" He shook his head. He was looking at his boots. "Good," she said, "because while you were out here, my team executed the warrant on your patrol vehicle and your duty locker." She held the folder up. There were new items in it now, additional pages photographs. "We found something." The laptop sat on Dobbs's booking desk like a verdict. Merritt opened it with the same matter-of-fact precision she brought to everything, the precision of someone who has thought carefully about sequence and knows that sequence is itself an argument. "I'm going to show you 3 items," she said, addressing the room, but looking at Pruitt. "Please don't speak during the video. There will be an opportunity for you to respond afterward." The first video loaded and began to play. It was body cam footage. The timestamp in the corner read 6 weeks prior. The footage showed Route 9, the same geography, different light. A late afternoon stop. The vehicle was a Honda CR-V mid-range, clean North Carolina plates. The driver was a black woman in her late 30s who identified herself in the early frames as a traveling nurse named Renata Okafor, coming off a shift at a hospital in Augusta and driving home. The footage showed Pruitt's approach, his fabricated lane departure, his escalating demands, the search of the vehicle conducted without a warrant and without consent, Okafor's repeated statement of non-consent audible throughout calm formal on the record. And then the footage showed the wallet. Okafor's wallet produced from her purse at Pruitt's instruction. Pruitt's hand going into the wallet. Pruitt's hand coming out of the wallet with a folded stack of bills. Pruitt's other hand moving to his vest pocket. The bills going into his vest pocket with a motion so practiced and economical it looked like a magic trick. Pruitt handing the empty wallet back. The room was completely silent during those 12 seconds. Not the silence of people holding their breath, but the silence of people whose breath has simply stopped. $4,800, Merritt said. Nurse Okafor has records showing she withdrew that amount from her savings account 3 days before the stop. It was her contribution to her daughter's first-semester college tuition. She reported the theft to our office 8 days later after she retained counsel. She was initially afraid to report it directly to the department. Merritt paused, understandably. She opened the second video. A different stop. A different car, a Honda Civic South Carolina plates, a young man, college age, a soccer jersey. The stop proceeded along familiar lines. The search. And then the footage showed Pruitt at the rear of the vehicle, partially obscured by the open door, and his hand going into the space between the door and the rear seat, not searching, not retrieving, but placing. A small baggie, the kind you use for evidence collection, set carefully down behind the seat cushion. And then, 3 seconds later, Pruitt's voice. "What have we got here?" The young man spent 11 days in the Calhoun County Jail before the charges were dropped for procedural reasons that had nothing to do with the truth of what had or hadn't been in his car. The third item was the emails. Merritt didn't play these. She printed the critical thread and placed it on the counter where it could be read. The exchange between Dale and Kyle Pruitt, discussing vehicles they had specifically targeted bid amounts, shell company rotation, to avoid creating a discernible pattern, the practical mechanics of acquiring cars worth $40,000 for a fraction of their value, and then reselling them through Kyle's legitimate dealership business at market rate. Based on the bank records we've subpoenaed, Merritt said, Officer Pruitt has received approximately $230,000 in payments from this arrangement over 6 years. Chief Falk has received approximately $60,000 through a more indirect mechanism, quarterly consulting fees, paid by Georgia Vehicle Recovery Partners to a LLC registered in Chief Falk's wife's name. Falk, still on the phone with his attorney near the front window, closed his eyes and set the phone against his leg for a moment. Hines at the back of the room was crying, not loudly, not dramatically. His face was dry, but his eyes were wet, and the quality of his stillness was different from Webb's. It was the stillness of someone who is very carefully not moving in order to not fall apart. He had known something was wrong. He had known for 14 months that something was wrong. He had not known the full shape of it, and knowing the full shape of it now was a different category of knowledge from suspicion, and the difference between those two categories had weight. Pruitt was standing in the center of the room. The filing cabinet at one end, the duty board at the other, the booking counter in front of him, the wall behind him. He had stopped moving. He had stopped the performance of unconcern. He had stopped everything except existing in this moment, which he was doing with the trapped, hollow concentration of a man who cannot leave and cannot stay and cannot think of a third option. He looked for the first time all evening small. General Cross looked at Webb. "Colonel, how do you want to proceed?" It was a genuine question, asked with the respect of a senior officer, consulting a subordinate whose judgment he trusts. They had known each other for 11 years. Cross had signed Webb's last 2 promotion recommendations. He had read every after-action report Webb had filed from 3 different theaters of operation, and each of those reports had demonstrated the same quality, the ability to think clearly when the conditions for clear thinking were at their most hostile. "I'd like to speak to Officer Pruitt," Webb said. He walked across the room. He walked with the deliberate, unhurried pace he had maintained throughout the entire evening, the pace of a man who is moving towards something rather than away from something, and he stopped 2 feet from Dale Pruitt and looked at him. The physical contrast was complete and undeniable. Webb at 6'3", with the breadth and presence of a man shaped by 25 years of demanding physical work and demanding physical discipline. Pruitt at 5'11", shrinking now in ways that had nothing to do with height, his shoulders forward, his chin down, the specific posture of a man whose scaffolding has been removed and is discovering what stands without it, which in his case was not much. Webb looked at him for a moment before speaking. He was not looking at Pruitt with anger. He was looking at him with the complete, uncondescending attention of a man who has decided to say true things carefully and wants to be understood. "When you pulled out of that turnout tonight," Webb said, his voice low enough that it was intimate without being private, "you didn't check my speed. You didn't observe a lane departure. You didn't smell anything. You saw a car you wanted and you saw a black man driving it, and you decided that those 2 facts were incompatible with each other and that the incompatibility gave you the right to do what you did." Pruitt's jaw was working. His eyes were moving to Cross, to Merritt, to Dobbs, looking for something. Support, maybe, or exit. "You used 1 word on that roadside." Webb continued. "1 word before you'd been standing at my window for 20 seconds. You know the word I'm referring to. I'm not going to repeat it, but I want you to understand something about that word and what it cost me to hear it without reacting to it. I have been in rooms where generals made decisions that determined whether entire units came home. I have been in buildings in 4 different countries where the wrong reaction at the wrong moment meant that people under my command died. I have spent 25 years training myself to choose my response in the most extreme conditions that human beings can create for each other." He paused. "And I used all of that tonight in the front seat of my own car to not respond to 1 word from you." The room was absolutely quiet. "I did it," Webb said, "because the alternative was to give you what you needed to make yourself the victim of this story. If I had reacted, if I had raised my voice or moved too fast or looked at you in a way you could characterize as threatening, you would have had the cover you needed for everything that followed. I took that cover away from you by doing nothing, because doing nothing was the correct tactical choice in a situation where I was at a structural disadvantage and you had institutional power." He paused again. "I want you to sit with that for a while. The only reason you're in handcuffs right now is that I chose not to put myself in a position where your version of events could displace mine." Pruitt was looking at the floor. "But I'm not the only person you did this to," Webb said. "The woman in that video, Renata Okafor. The young man in the Civic. The architect from Charlotte who signed over his car at the side of the road because he was afraid. Every person in Merritt's spreadsheet who drove through this county with the wrong plates and the wrong skin color and the wrong car and encountered you on the wrong day. I am standing here because I had the specific combination of rank and resources and access that put me in a position to do something about this. Most of them didn't. Most of them just lost something and drove away diminished. His voice had not risen. It had, if anything, gotten quieter, and the quieter it got, the more completely it filled the room. You targeted them because you believed their disadvantage made them safe to steal from. You were wrong about that. About all of it. He held Pruitt's gaze for 2 more seconds. Then he turned. "Sergeant Dobbs," he said. Dobbs stood up from his chair. He looked like a man who has been waiting to be asked to stand. "You're a good man who stayed silent too long," Webb said. "I've seen that before. I've seen what it costs. I'm giving you the opportunity to do something about it right now if you're willing." Dobbs looked at Webb. He looked at Pruitt. He reached across the booking counter and picked up the handcuffs, the same pair the ones Pruitt had used on Webb twice tonight, the ones that had left the red marks above his wrist bones. He walked around the counter. He walked to Pruitt. He stood in front of him. "Trent," he said. His voice was quiet and not unkind, which was somehow worse than if it had been neither of those things. "Turn around." Pruitt looked at Dobbs for a long moment. Something moved across his face, several things in sequence too fast to fully name. Disbelief first, then a kind of bargaining expression, the look of a man instinctively searching for the path around an obstacle. Then something closer to pleading, which sat badly on a face that had been set for 7 years in the opposite configuration. "Ray," he said, "come on. Come on. You know me. We've worked together for Trent." Dobbs's voice did not waver. "Turn around. You can't do this." "I was doing my job." "I stopped a suspect. I followed the procedure. Everything I did tonight was—" "Turn around," Dobbs said. Agent Merritt stepped forward. She was standing 6 feet back, hands at her sides, giving Dobbs the space to do what needed to be done. She was watching with the careful attention of someone who understands that this moment matters in ways that go beyond the procedural. Pruitt turned around. His hands came up behind his back. The motion had the quality of something that had been resisted up to the moment of surrender and then completed all at once like a wall giving way. His shoulders dropped. His head went slightly forward. Dobbs applied the cuffs. He applied them at the correct position at the wrist, not above it. He checked the fit. He did not tighten them further than necessary. "Trent Allen Pruitt," Dobbs said. His voice had gained something in the last 30 seconds, a steadiness that came from having finally stepped through a door he'd been standing in front of for a very long time. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Do you understand these rights as I have read them to you?" Pruitt said nothing. He was staring at the linoleum. "Do you understand these rights?" "Yes," Pruitt said, very quietly. The word had the quality of something defeated. On the other side of the room, Agent Merritt's colleague, Agent Torres, who had been monitoring Chief Falk since his attorney advisement, stepped forward. Falk didn't resist. He didn't stand dramatically or make a statement. He simply stood up from the chair with the slow, deliberate movement of a very heavy man and extended his wrists and allowed himself to be handcuffed and looked at nothing in particular for a moment before looking at the floor. General Cross stood near the window. He had not moved in some time. He watched the proceedings with the contained, authoritative stillness of a man who has been the instrument of several large consequences in his career and has learned to be present for them rather than apart from them. Webb stopped Pruitt at the holding cell door. Pruitt was being guided by Dobbs, moving through the corridor with the shuffling, reduced gait of a man in restraints who has not learned yet how to carry the weight of them. He stopped when Webb said his name, and he turned, and the look on his face had moved past everything strategic and arrived somewhere simpler and more final. One thing Webb said. Pruitt looked at him. His eyes were wet. Not crying, not yet, but wet in the way that eyes go wet when everything behind them has been under pressure for too long. "My car," Webb said. "You put your hand on the rear quarter panel when you walked around it on the stop. You were leaning, there's a print in the wax." He paused. "I just had it detailed. You're paying for that." For a single improbable second, something moved across Pruitt's face that might in a different context have been almost human. And then Dobbs moved them forward, and the cell door clanged shut, and the corridor was quiet. Webb stood in the holding area. He looked at the closed cell door, the same broken light overhead, the same drain in the floor, the concrete box that had been designed to diminish people and had failed completely to diminish the person it was built to hold. He turned away. Outside, the helicopters had pulled back to a wider orbit. Route 9 was still blocked. The parking lot was still full of federal vehicles and federal agents doing the patient, methodical work of documentation and collection and chain of custody and all the other institutional procedures through which a Tuesday evening in August in a small Georgia county becomes eventually something that matters beyond itself. The Charger sat at the edge of the lot under its own dignity. Webb walked to it. He ran one hand along the fender. He felt the wax under his palm warm from the residual heat of the day, smooth with the kind of care that comes from having put your own hands into something for a long time. He stood there for a moment. Then he got in, and the engine turned over with the deep, authoritative rumble of a machine that has been rebuilt correctly, and he let it idle, and the sound of it moved through the parking lot and out onto Route 9 and into the warm Georgia night. He did not drive away yet. He sat in the car and let the engine warm and listened to it, and thought about nothing for 30 seconds, which was the first time he had thought about nothing all evening. Then he put it in gear. He drove exactly the speed limit. 48 hours. That was how long it took from the moment Agent Merritt's team cleared the Calhoun Falls Police Department's dashcam archive to the moment the image appeared on the first major network affiliate's evening broadcast. 48 hours, which in the contemporary news ecosystem is roughly the equivalent of a geological age, enough time for a story to travel from a local affiliate in Atlanta to a national desk in New York to every screen in the country. The image that did the work was not from the courtroom or the station. It was from Pruitt's own dashcam. It had been recovered fully intact, not deleted, not overwritten from the secure server backup that the department's IT contractor maintained, and that Pruitt had apparently not known about, because the department had switched vendors 8 months ago, and the new vendors' backup protocols were more thorough than the old ones. The image was a still frame from the footage of the stop. It showed the Charger on the shoulder of Route 9, its door open, Webb standing beside it. The slate-black paint of the car filled the left half of the frame. Webb stood in the center, 6'3", broad, absolutely still, both hands visible, his posture carrying the specific dignity of a man who has decided exactly how to exist in this moment. On the right side of the frame, visible in partial profile, was Officer Dale Pruitt, in uniform, one hand on his holster and on his face captured by the dashboard optics with the impersonal clarity of a machine that records without judgment a smile. The smile was the story before the story was told. It was not an evil smile in the cartoon sense. It was more ordinary than that which made it worse. It was the smile of a man who is doing something he does often and is pleased about doing it, the comfortable proprietary smile of someone operating in what they understand to be their natural domain. That image ran for 12 hours on every major broadcast news platform and indefinitely on every social media platform that existed. The hashtag appeared within 6 hours and reached the top 10 within 12. By the end of the first full day, the image of Marcus Webb and the Charger had been shared more times than any law enforcement-related story in Georgia in a calendar year. The story that accompanied the image was thorough and accurate, Because Merritt's office had released a detailed statement simultaneous with the footage, including the summary findings of the 9-month investigation, the charges filed, and the background on the civil forfeiture scheme. The reaction was complicated in the way that reactions to clear injustice are often complicated, an enormous current of anger, running alongside disbelief, running alongside the specific wearying response of the people who are never surprised by this kind of story, because it is in some form their story, and they have been waiting for someone to believe it. What was different about this story, what made it something other than another entry in a long catalog, was the charger and Webb. And the specific combination of those two things, with the 9-month investigation and the Black Hawk helicopters and the 2-star general who had walked into a county booking area and demanded a colleague's release with the quiet, total authority of an institution that was not interested in local jurisdictional claims. Dale Pruitt was indicted 6 days later. His shell companies were frozen. The auction house in Macon suspended its relationship with his management company and released a statement that they described as a condemnation, though it was written by a communications firm and contained no specifics. The 3 shell company principals, Kyle's former college roommate Drew Halton, and 2 others who had been receiving monthly payments in exchange for the use of their names on the corporate registrations, agreed immediately to cooperate in exchange for consideration. 138 former vehicle owners were contacted by Merritt's office and informed of the civil action on their behalf. 43 of them retained counsel through the federal referral process. 27 restitution claims were filed within the first month. Hines met with Merritt 3 times in the 2 weeks following the arrest. He was 26, and he was frightened, and he told her everything he knew, which was not everything, but was considerably more than nothing, and he did it without being asked twice and without conditions. He had kept the impound form copy in his jacket pocket through the entire night and handed it over on the first request. Merritt noted in her official file the portion of the file that bore on the question of Hines's culpability and cooperation, that Officer Caleb Hines had printed that form before the federal response arrived, when it was still entirely possible that the night would end with Pruitt intact and Hines's job dependent on his continued silence. She noted this fact and weighted it accordingly. 3 months later, the courtroom in the Richard B. Russell Federal Building in downtown Atlanta was full. It was full in the way that courtrooms become full when a story has moved from the news cycle into the public imagination, with people who had driven from other counties, reporters from outlets in 4 states, 7 attorneys representing former vehicle seizure victims in their own related civil proceedings, and in the gallery's second row in full dress uniform, Colonel Marcus Webb. He was sitting the way he always sat, back straight, feet flat, hands in his lap. But there was something different about him in the dress uniform. The civilian clothes he had been wearing on Route 9 had been deliberately chosen for anonymity. The dress uniform, with its double row of ribbons and the silver insignia on the collar and the service stripes on the sleeve, communicated something else entirely. It communicated the accumulated evidence of a career: the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with Valor device, the Purple Heart, the Combat Infantryman Badge, the Master Parachutist Badge, the Special Forces tab. A career written in metal and cloth, assembled over 25 years of specific, demanding, costly service. He did not wear it for theater. He wore it because when a man is asked to testify in federal court about events that concern the treatment of his person and his dignity, he is entitled to appear as the full version of himself, rather than as the civilian-clothed, anonymous version that had been targeted on Route 9. Across the courtroom at the defense table, Dale Pruitt sat. He had been in federal detention since the night of the arrest. The 3 months had produced a version of him that was recognizable only in outline. He had lost 30 pounds. The dress uniform shirt that had stretched across his shoulders was gone. He was wearing a standard-issue court appearance suit, 2 sizes too large, provided by the facility because his own clothes no longer fit, and his wife, who had engaged a divorce attorney within the first week, had not brought him anything from home. His hair had been cut by the facility barber according to facility protocols. He sat with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the defense table and the specific quality of not looking that was its own kind of looking. He did not look at Webb. The prosecutor, a United States attorney named Carolyn Watkins Bell, who had spent 15 years in the Public Corruption Unit and had tried 37 federal cases without a loss, moved through the evidence with the systematic efficiency of someone who knows the architecture of her argument so thoroughly that she can move through it at any speed without losing the shape. She began with the spreadsheet, the 138 seizures, the racial and geographic profile, the auction shell companies. She presented it not as a conspiracy, which required intent and planning and meetings, but as a pattern which required only repetition and which, in this case, had the additional advantage of being documented in the defendant's own communications. She read 3 emails aloud, including the one about the BMW architect from Charlotte. She let the words sit in the air of the courtroom. Then she called Renata Okafor. Okafor was 40 years old. She had driven 2 hours from Augusta for this testimony, and she sat in the witness chair with the composed, exhausted dignity of a woman who has been angry for 3 months and has transmuted the anger into something more useful. She described the stop precisely. She described the production of the wallet. She described watching Pruitt's hand go into the wallet and come out with her money. She described handing her daughter the copy of the arrest report 3 days later and explaining why she couldn't complete the tuition payment and watching her daughter's face. She did not cry when she said this. She said it in the same register in which she had said everything else. Factual, clean, complete, and the effect on the jury was visible in the specific quality of their attention, which had been professional and engaged, and was now something more personal than that. The defense attorney, a court-appointed public defender named James Olson, who was not unintelligent and who had reviewed the discovery material with the thorough pessimism of a man who understood what he was working with, attempted what he could. He asked Okafor whether she had been formally charged. She had not. He asked whether she had filed an official complaint with the department at the time of the stop. She had not, explaining that she had not believed it would be addressed. He noted for the record that there was no direct evidence that the cash was taken, rather than he paused here with the faint awkwardness of someone using language they don't believe misplaced in the commotion of the stop. Okafor looked at him for a moment and then said that she did not misplace $4,800 of her daughter's tuition money, and the jury looked at Olson with an expression that told him clearly that this line of questioning was not helping. When Webb took the stand, the room went to a silence that had texture to it, not the empty silence of an empty room, but the full silence of 140 people choosing not to speak. Watkins Bell stood at the podium. Colonel Webb, you are a Special Operations Commander. You have been trained in hand-to-hand combat, tactical disarmament, and high-threat neutralization. When Officer Pruitt placed you in handcuffs on Route 9, you were physically capable of resisting. Why didn't you? Webb leaned slightly toward the microphone. His voice was the same voice as always, the voice that did not raise itself, that assumed it would be heard because it had always been heard when it needed to be. Because I swore an oath, he said. I swore an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies. That oath does not have a geography clause. It does not apply only overseas, or only when it's convenient, or only when the enemies are wearing the uniforms of foreign states. The law is part of what I swore to defend. Respecting it even when the man wearing it was making a mockery of it was the only way I knew how to honor what I'd sworn. He paused. If I had fought him physically, he continued, I would have become what he needed me to be. I would have given him the evidence for the story he was trying to tell about me. By using every hour of discipline that 25 years of service taught me, I exposed the story he was actually telling about himself. And what is that story? Colonel Watkins Bell asked. Webb turned his head. He looked at Pruitt directly with the same flat, dark, unfrightened eyes that had looked at him through the window of the Charger on Route 9. Pruitt did not look up. A man who confused the law with his own appetite, Webb said, and a coward who could only feel powerful when the person in front of him had no institutional protection. That's the story. The jury returned in 4 hours and 50 minutes. The forewoman was a retired school principal from Decatur who had the quality of someone who has spent 30 years making decisions about other people's children and has therefore long since stopped being uncertain about her own judgments. She stood and read the verdict in a voice that did not waver. Guilty count 1 deprivation of rights under color of law. Guilty count 2 conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Guilty count 3 extortion under color of official right. Guilty count 4 civil forfeiture fraud. Guilty count 5 perjury. Guilty count 6 evidence tampering. 6 counts, clean through top to bottom, no reductions, no partial findings. The kind of verdict that tells a story as much as a judgment. Pruitt did not react visibly. He sat at the defense table and appeared to be receiving the words from a very large distance, as if he were in the room but also somewhere else, simultaneously somewhere quieter and further away. Olson put a hand on his shoulder. He did not appear to feel it. The sentencing hearing was 3 weeks later. Judge Patricia Odom had been on the federal bench for 16 years. She had the reputation of a person who reads the full case file and the full presentencing report, and does not arrive at the sentencing hearing with a number already decided which was true, and also the reputation of someone with no patience for the specific category of crime in which a person exploits institutional authority, which was also true and perhaps more relevant. She looked over her glasses at Pruitt for a long moment before she spoke. "I have spent 16 years on this bench," she said. "I have sentenced people who committed acts of violence for comprehensible reasons. I have sentenced people who made terrible choices under terrible circumstances. I have sentenced people whose crimes were the product of genuine desperation or addiction or the cumulative failure of every institution that should have given them a different path." She paused. "Mr. Pruitt, you are none of those people. You had a stable income, a position of trust, and a community that extended you the authority of that position in good faith. You used that authority over 6 years to systematically steal from people who you had identified as unlikely to be able to defend themselves. You targeted them specifically and deliberately because of their race and their geographic distance from the resources that would have allowed them to fight back." Pruitt's hands were flat on the defense table. They were trembling slightly, not from cold, which was impossible in the heated courtroom, but from the involuntary, uncontrollable tremoring of someone whose nervous system has been running at maximum suppressive effort for 3 months and is now beginning to fail at it. "You further," the judge continued, "attempted to use your position to corrupt a physical evidence process on the night of your arrest. The testimony and video evidence before this court make clear that you made a deliberate decision to introduce fabricated evidence into a federal investigation while federal agents were present and recording. The only thing that prevented you from doing so was the presence of armed federal personnel and your own belated calculation of the consequences." She squared the papers in front of her. "For the crimes of which you have been convicted, I sentence you to 22 years in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons with no possibility of parole. Your municipal pension is revoked pursuant to the moral turpitude clause of your employment contract. All personal assets identifiable by the Department of Justice Forensic Accounting Team are subject to seizure for distribution to the Victim Restitution Fund, which Agent Merritt's office will administer." She struck the gavel with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Kyle Pruitt received 14 years in a separate proceeding that afternoon. His shell companies were dissolved by court order, their remaining assets liquidated, and added to the restitution fund. His brother watched this proceeding from the holding area via closed-circuit television in the company of a marshal. Chief Gordon Falk had taken the plea deal 12 years full cooperation in the state legislative inquiry into Georgia's civil forfeiture statutes and the specific testimony that allowed the DOJ to document the full financial relationship between himself and the Pruitt operation. As the marshals moved Pruitt from the defendant's table toward the holding area, the path they took brought him within arm's reach of the first row of the gallery. He stopped walking for a moment. One of the marshals put a hand on his arm, not hard but firmly, and he looked up. He found Webb. Webb was sitting in his dress uniform with his hands resting on his knees, and the expression he had worn throughout the trial, attentive, composed, present, without performance. Pruitt looked at him. His eyes were wet, the same wet, not crying quality as the night in the station, amplified now by everything that had happened since. He said something. It was quiet enough that only the people within 3 feet heard it clearly. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't know who you were." Webb was quiet for a moment. Around them, the room was in motion, reporters gathering materials, spectators standing, marshals completing their administrative duties, but in the small circle of space between Webb and Pruitt, there was a stillness. "That's the problem," Webb said. His voice was the same as always. Calm, clear, and honest. "You shouldn't have to know who I am to treat me like a human being." The marshals moved. Pruitt was guided forward. The doors to the holding area opened and closed. The courtroom continued around them, moving on to the next business of a federal court on a Thursday afternoon. Webb sat for a moment after Pruitt was gone. Then he stood, buttoned the bottom button of his dress jacket, and walked out. Dale Pruitt was processed into the United States Penitentiary at Hazleton in West Virginia on a Tuesday morning in late November, when the sky above the facility was the color of old concrete and the temperature made the air feel like wet cloth against the skin. He came off the transport van in leg irons and wrist restraints, along with 11 other men who were not looking at each other, and he was processed through intake with the impersonal efficiency of a large institution that has received thousands of people and does not find any of them particularly remarkable. His civilian clothes were confiscated. He was stripped, searched, showered with institutional soap, and issued the standard clothing: socks, underwear, a gray t-shirt, orange pants, slip-on shoes. His personal items, a watch, a wedding ring, a wallet with 3 photographs, were inventoried and placed in a sealed envelope marked with his inmate number, 6714-A. He was not Dale Pruitt anymore in any official sense. He was 6714A, and the distinction between the two, between the man who had swaggered through a booking area in Calhoun Falls with his feet up on the desk and a soda in his hand, and an absolute certainty about his own untouchability, was, if you were looking at it clearly, the entire story. Because of his former profession, the warden determined that general population placement was not viable. Correction officers who had worked in law enforcement were a specific risk category, not the threat they posed to the population, which was manageable, but the threat the population posed to them, which was not. Pruitt was assigned to administrative segregation, ad sege. From the outside, from a distance, the words sound like a technical designation, something administrative, something clinical. What it means in the concrete specifics of day-to-day reality at a high-security federal facility is 23 hours in a cell. The cell was 7 feet by 10 feet. The floor was concrete, painted a matte-resistant gray. The walls were the color of institutional cream, a shade that had been chosen according to some mid-century theory of institutional design for its pacifying properties, and which in practice induced a specific patient, grinding form of psychological pressure that was not quite anxiety and not quite despair, but lived in the territory between them. The ceiling was 8 feet high. The single light fixture was recessed behind reinforced glass and burned at the same brightness at all hours, which meant that the distinction between day and night ceased to exist as an environmental fact and existed only as a concept. And concepts are harder to hold on to than facts when you are in a room for 23 hours. The window was 4 inches wide. Reinforced glass. It looked onto the exterior wall of the adjacent building, another concrete surface 7 feet away, absorbing weather without interest. In the first week, Pruitt paced. The cell was 34 steps around the perimeter, and he walked it until his feet blistered under the thin soles of the facility shoes. He did this because motion felt like control, and control was the one thing his entire adult life had been organized around maintaining. He yelled at the guards on the third night, not angry yelling exactly, more the panicked, insistent yelling of a man who has discovered that the structures he always relied on for support have been removed and is making noise to locate them. He cited codes and procedures and rights. He reminded Officer Cruz, the duty guard on his corridor, that he had been in law enforcement, that he understood procedure, that there were protections. Officer Cruz was a large man who had worked at Hazleton for 9 years. He had seen in those 9 years several hundred people arrive at the same discovery that Pruitt was making, the discovery that the rules a person knows from one side of an institutional door do not apply in the same way from the other side. He slid the food tray through the slot in the door without comment. On the night when Pruitt's voice cracked against the steel, he stopped outside the door for a moment. "You're not an officer," he said through the slot. "Not unkindly, just factually. You're 6714A. And you're in here because you spent 7 years deciding that rights were optional for everybody except you. Eat the loaf. It's better when it's warm." The slot closed. Pruitt sat on the floor of his cell and held his tray. The neutral loaf, a brick of compressed vegetables and grain protein that was nutritionally complete and texturally like eating compressed regret, sat on the tray and cooled. He ate it because not eating it made everything worse in a direction he couldn't afford. Outside the walls, the world was conducting the systematic demolition of everything he had built. The DOJ forensic team had found 2 bank accounts he hadn't disclosed. One offshore through a credit union in Belize that held $86,000 in funds he couldn't account for through any legitimate income source. His house went to the asset seizure. His truck went to the asset seizure. His wife, who had retained a divorce attorney so quickly after his arrest that the filing came before his first court appearance, was awarded the personal property that remained, the furniture. The children's things, her own car, and then moved to Memphis with the 2 children, changing the kids' last names back to her maiden name by court order within 60 days of the separation. The papers arrived by process server while Pruitt was in his 1 hour of outdoor recreation, a wire cage in the yard open to the sky, which he could have to himself or not, depending on the scheduling protocols, and which in November was cold in the specific penetrating way of high-elevation West Virginia, a cold that got into the joints and stayed. He read the letter 3 times. His wife had included a handwritten note separate from the legal documents. It was 4 sentences. It said that she had tried to understand it and that she could not, and that she would not be coming to visit, and that the children had been asked at school more than once by other children about the video of their father on the news. The children asked her why Daddy was smiling like that in the picture. She had not had an answer. He folded the letter and held it. A corrections officer 30 feet away was watching a perimeter, looking at nothing. The sky above the wire cage was the same concrete gray it had been on the morning he arrived. He did not cry then. He cried later in the cell, in the dark hours that he knew were dark only because his body's circadian function told him so, not because the light changed. He cried the way a man cries when there is no one to manage his response in front of, without structure or strategy, with the full, ungainly weight of it. He had done it all for money and status and the daily practice of power. And here was where money and status and power extracted through cruelty from people who couldn't stop him had delivered him. A 7x10 concrete box with a 4-inch window looking at a wall. 8 months into his sentence, Pruitt was granted trustee status. It was not a reward for rehabilitation or demonstrated remorse in the institutional framework of federal corrections. Trustee status at that point was a function of his having accumulated no disciplinary infractions in his first 8 months, which was less a testament to his character than to the fact that in administrative segregation, the opportunities for disciplinary infractions are structurally limited. But it came with an assignment 2 hours a day in the facility library, sorting and cataloging donated materials. It was the smallest possible step back into a human-shaped existence, and Pruitt took it with the desperate gratitude of a man who has been in a concrete box for 8 months and has discovered what boxes do to the parts of a person that require space. The library was small. 6 rows of metal shelving, 3 tables with attached metal chairs, a single computer terminal for legal research that was available by appointment. It smelled of old paper and the specific dust that accumulates on books that are donated rather than purchased books with other people's marginalia in the margins and other people's creases on the spines. On the Tuesday morning in July when the thing happened, Pruitt was sorting a collection of donated magazines 6 months' worth, bundled with a rubber band and sent by a community organization in Baltimore that donated reading materials to federal facilities. He worked through them methodically, the way he had learned to do everything in the facility methodically without rushing, because rushing implied that there was somewhere better to be when there was not. He separated them by date. He noted the condition. He placed them in the appropriate section of the periodical rack. He found it near the bottom of the bundle. It was a national magazine, one of the major weekly ones with the high-quality paper stock and the high-resolution cover printing that distinguished it from the newsstand tabloids. The cover was an exterior-shot tarmac late afternoon light, the reddish quality of Georgia summer evening. In the foreground, in full dress uniform, Colonel Marcus Webb. Behind him, and to the left, a UH-60 Black Hawk on the apron, its rotor blades drooping in rest. And behind him, and to the right, partially visible, the slate-black quarter panel of a 1969 Dodge Charger RT. The headline read, "The Quiet Colonel, How One Soldier's Patience Dismantled a Corrupt Empire." Pruitt's hands stopped moving. He stood between 2 shelving units in the empty library. The other trustee on duty had gone to the bathroom, and he held the magazine and looked at the cover. And the cover looked back at him with the flat, informational patience of an object that does not experience irony, and therefore cannot be accused of deploying it. He opened it. The article was 8 pages long by the standard of the publication, with multiple photographs and a sidebar. The writing was careful and thorough and not sensational. It was the work of a journalist who understood the story well enough to present it without embellishment, which was correct, because the story did not require embellishment. It described the stop. It described the station. It described the Black Hawk arrival and the general walking through the door and the FBI agent with the 9-month investigation file that turned a traffic stop into a federal racketeering case. It quoted Judge Odom calling Dale Pruitt a disgrace to every honest officer in America. It quoted Renata Okafor, describing the restitution payment she had received as feeling like getting back something I thought was just gone forever. It quoted 5 other former seizure victims by name. It did not quote Pruitt or anyone from his family because neither was available for comment. Pruitt read it all. He read it with his back against the metal shelving and the magazine held in hands that were shaking with a frequency that had nothing to do with cold or caffeine, and everything to do with the specific tremor of a man confronting something that cannot be managed. And then he turned to page 43, where the sidebar ran. The sidebar was titled, "The Charger Rides Again." The photograph was from an auction venue, an upscale space in Atlanta, vaulted ceilings, the kind of lighting designed to make objects look their best. In the center of the frame on a low platform, the slate-black 1969 Dodge Charger RT, clean and perfect and present. The restoration work visible in every surface, the careful paint, the precise chrome, the meticulous bodywork that represented 4 years of patient, skilled labor. Beside the car, shaking hands with a woman Pruitt did not recognize, was Marcus Webb. He was in civilian clothes, dark slacks, a plain shirt, and he was smiling, which was the first time Pruitt had seen him smile. And it was a particular kind of smile, the kind that belongs to a moment of completion. The woman the caption identified was the executive director of the newly established Calhoun Falls Legal Defense Initiative. The auction price $230,000. 100% of the proceeds donated. Pruitt's eyes moved to the quote below the photograph. Webb's voice, the same voice that had spoken to him through the bars of his holding cell through the Charger's window. Across the courtroom came off the page with its characteristic quietness. "A car is just metal," the quote read. "It's rubber and chrome and 4 years of Saturdays. But justice is the engine that keeps this country moving. If selling this car gives one family the legal representation they need to get back what was taken from them, then it's the best drive I ever had. That Charger's whole purpose was to get me to Calhoun Falls on a Thursday evening. Turns out it did exactly what it was supposed to do." Pruitt set the magazine down. He set it down on the floor of the library with a sound that was small and flat and final, the sound of something released rather than dropped, and he stood with his back against the metal shelving and looked at the image of the car he had coveted from the moment he saw it on Route 9, the car that had been the object of his appetite and the instrument of his plan and the proof of everything he had believed about himself and his right to take what he wanted, and he understood something. The car had not been on Route 9 by accident. It had been exactly where it needed to be, and the man driving it had been exactly who he needed to be. And what had happened in Calhoun Falls, Georgia on a Thursday evening in August had happened, not because Marcus Webb was extraordinary in his patience though he was, but because Dale Pruitt had been so ordinary in his cruelty that he had never imagined anyone would be able to hold still long enough for the full weight of it to fall on him. He had kicked a stone. He had been certain it was a pebble, and he had brought a mountain down on his own head. He sat down on the library floor with his back against the shelving and his legs out in front of him, and held his face in his hands and sat there for a long time. The fluorescent lights above him burned with the same indifferent brightness they always burned with. Somewhere outside the library door, the facility was conducting its ordinary afternoon business. Down the corridor, in administrative segregation, his cell was waiting for him. He did not feel sorry. Not in the way that sorry requires a clear object and a clear direction. He felt instead something that was close to the end of something, the specific exhausted emptiness of a man who has finally arrived at the full extent of the consequences he set in motion and found them to be in every measurable way exactly what they should be. He sat there until the corrections officer knocked on the library door to indicate that his time was up. He stood. He put the magazine back in the periodical rack in its correct date sequence. He straightened the row. He walked to the door. He did not look at the Charger on the cover again. The Calhoun Falls Legal Defense Initiative opened its doors in October, 4 months after the auction, in a small office above a tax preparation firm on Franklin Street, the same Franklin Street where Dale Pruitt had gotten his hair cut every 2 weeks at Roy's for 7 years. It had 2 full-time attorneys, 1 paralegal, and a case intake coordinator who had previously worked for the Georgia Attorney General's office and who had taken the position at a salary reduction because she believed in what the organization was doing. By the end of its first year, it had taken on 31 civil forfeiture challenges in Georgia, settled 24 of them in the former owner's favor, and returned a combined $1.4 million in wrongfully seized property and cash. The Georgia State Legislature passed the Vehicle Seizure Accountability and Reform Act, referred to informally, though not in the official title as the Webb Act, 11 months after the arrest. The bill closed the primary loophole that had allowed no conviction seizures of vehicles valued over a certain threshold, required a judicial review hearing within 72 hours of any vehicle seizure, and mandated the recording and public disclosure of all civil forfeiture auction results. It passed the State Senate 41-16 and the State House 118-62 with bipartisan support that the political reporters covering it attributed to the specific and powerful optics of a decorated federal officer in handcuffs in a county booking area. Webb did not attend the signing. He sent a brief message through General Cross's office thanking the governor for the action and indicating that he was deployed and unavailable. Cross attended in his place and was photographed shaking hands with the governor in front of the bill, a photograph that ran on the front page of 2 Georgia newspapers. Caleb Hines was transferred to a department in Fulton County 6 weeks after the arrests, facilitated by a recommendation from Agent Merritt and a transfer request that was processed with unusual speed. He received a formal commendation letter from the FBI field office in Atlanta acknowledging his cooperation and his decision to preserve evidence at a moment when the outcome was uncertain. He printed the letter and kept it in his wallet. He thought about it on the days when the job felt too hard for the wrong reasons. Renata Okafor received her restitution payment in December, $4,800, the exact amount taken, plus interest calculated from the date of the stop. She texted the bank deposit confirmation to her daughter, who texted back a photograph of her university enrollment confirmation for the spring semester. General Cross sent Webb a text on a Thursday evening in late November. It read, "Riley took a plea. 15 years? The new chief is a good officer. The law changed. You changed it." Webb read the text on his porch. He set his phone face down on the railing. The Blue Ridge Mountains in late November turn a specific shade of gold in the last hour of afternoon light. Not the blazing, assertive gold of peak fall which had passed a month ago, but the quieter, more definitive gold of a season completing itself, a color that has given up its brightness without losing its warmth, that has arrived at something that might be called finality, if finality could be beautiful. Colonel Marcus Webb sat on the porch of his home in rural Virginia and watched the light move through that gold and into the gray-purple that follows it, and thought about nothing in particular, which was the closest thing to rest that his particular mind could manage. In the driveway sat a Ford F-150, dark blue practical, several years old. It was not the Charger. The Charger was in Atlanta, or rather, the Charger was the 31 cases, and the 2 attorneys, and the $1.4 million, and the college enrollment confirmation text, which was a better form than it had ever been as a car. He did not miss it exactly. He had made what he made it from and sold what he made it for, and both of those things were complete, and completion was its own kind of satisfaction. His phone was on the porch railing face down, General Cross's text still open on it. He had not typed a reply yet. He was thinking about what to say, which was a thing he always did thought. Before he spoke, thought carefully, thought about what was true and what was necessary and what the correct register was for the truth being delivered. He had been doing this since his mother taught him to do it, sitting in the back seat of a Buick driving home from church, and he had kept doing it through 25 years of service, and he intended to keep doing it for whatever came next. The screen door opened. His wife Sarah came out in the way she came out, quietly, without announcement, with the complete familiarity of someone who has long since stopped needing to announce herself because she has been present in this space long enough to belong to it. She wrapped her arms around his waist from behind and rested her head on his shoulder, and he put his large hand over hers on his stomach, and they stayed like that in the last of the light. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm good," he said. "What are you thinking about?" He was quiet for a moment. He was thinking about Route 9 and the hawk in the thermal and the holding cell and the concrete wall with "God sees" scratched into the paint. He was thinking about Renata Okafor's daughter and the enrollment confirmation and Hines's face in the booking area and Dobbs's hands on the handcuffs. He was thinking about Dale Pruitt in a library in West Virginia holding a magazine. About how fast things change, he said. How you can be driving down a road and be going somewhere, and then everything shifts and you're somewhere else entirely in ways you didn't choose. "And then you're here," she said. "And then you're here," he agreed. He looked out at the country road that ran south from their property, the 2-lane asphalt road that wound through the trees and disappeared in the direction of the valley. In the fading light, it was empty and clean, no flashing blues, no speed trap, no cruiser easing out of a shadow behind a billboard. Just the road going where it went, open and indifferent and available to anyone willing to drive it correctly. He had won, not by fighting, which he had been capable of, but by holding still when every instinct and every injury said move. He had won because 25 years of discipline had given him something more durable than anger, which was the ability to outlast the moment in which someone tried to reduce him to less than what he was. He was the rock. The wave had broken itself against him and retreated, and the shore it left behind was not the same shore it had found. It was cleaner slightly in the specific way that things are cleaned, not by being polished, but by having the corruption removed from them. He felt a hawk circle somewhere above the tree line in the last of the light. He did not see it. He felt it the way you feel presence in a landscape you know well enough to read. He stayed on the porch until the light was gone. Then he picked up his phone, typed 3 words to General Cross, understood, "Thank you," and went inside. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more stories about justice, courage, and the people who refuse to be made small. Every story we tell is dedicated to the people whose names we haven't yet heard.